question on it on the ethics paper. But I don't think it's really possible to understand fully the ethics paper side of things without knowing all that background. And the other thing I would say is that on the Baylis paper, it's quite common sometimes to get questions on Guernsey's international identity, how Guernsey fits into the world in the international movement. And this is a useful thing you can throw in. If you get a question like that, you can mention in that extra material you can use, basically. That's another example of Guernsey doing something internationally. One of only, I think, only 2 examples really where Guernsey has a completely independent system for being evaluated independently of the UK. The other one being the OECD on tax transparency. So it's just useful to know that as a background thing. So those doing criminal paper need to know anyway it's in the syllabus, and those who are not doing crime may find it useful as general background. So let's kick off with talking about what money laundering is. Before we do that, I'd just like to say, if anyone has any questions, please ask me as we go. I'm happy to take questions at the end as well, but I'm happy if this is interactive as possible. So if you have any queries or I say something that doesn't make sense to you, please just come. So what is money laundering? Well, money laundering is basically the process for disguising the origin of criminal money. It's steps people take to conceal the fact. Oh, we've got, where are they? Excuse me.
I've got sent these two.
Oh, perfect. It's introduction one. Yeah,
nice. So just move to that one.
Why?
They're not transferred, but these come up as PDFs.
I don't understand what it is, so I didn't PDF them. I sent them to PowerPoint.
No questions in storage. It's really, really odd. I don't understand it, I'm afraid.
Okay, it doesn't matter. I can do it without the slides. It's all right. Yeah.
And then other Adobe. When it's a PDF is like a photograph or something, it doesn't open as a packet, as a software. It's just, I'm sorry.
That's right, don't worry. I'll do it with that. That's all right. That's right, don't worry. We're recording. We started.
Yeah.
Yeah. Okay. Yes. So money laundering is basically the process of trying to conceal the criminal origin of assets, and this can be done in a number of ways. There are internationally 3 recognised ways of money laundering, which are placement, layering, and integration. And placement is what it sounds when you first put criminal proceeds into the financial system, and that will normally be by putting money into a bank account. Layering is where you put in place stages to distance yourself from the proceeds. You might create a company, and then you might transfer the money in the name of that company, and you might then create a trust structure which holds the shares in the company, and then you create another company and transfer the money back and forth. You put lots of layers in place which make it hard to see the link between you and the criminal acts that generated the proceeds. And then integration is when the money rejoins the financial system, or the financial systems, or other areas of illegal activity for legitimate purposes. So you use it to buy a house. So the house purchase itself is perfectly standard, nothing criminal about that. The only criminal link is the fact that the money came from a tainted source. So that is essentially money laundering. Now, it used not to matter to people. Money laundering as a criminal concept is really quite a new thing. So when I was growing up, for example, in Guernsey in the 70s, 60s and 70s, people would happily take money from all over the world, no questions asked. The entire financial system for Guernsey in most places would happily take criminal money. If you had money and you wanted to bank it, it didn't matter. And people will have memories of the likes of Aslam Nadir coming into offices here with suitcases full of money and handing it over and putting it into a bank account. That happened in London all the time as well. So what changed? Well, basically, in the late 80s, people began to become concerned about this in the context of drugs. People became very concerned that drug money was being used, funneled through the criminal systems, particularly in the United States, and no one was doing anything about it. There's nothing people could do about it. And so the first thing that happened internationally was the Vienna Convention. And the Vienna Convention is a UN convention about drugs, and that required countries to put in place legislation to stop people using the process of drug trafficking monies through the financial systems. So Guernsey did the same thing. Most countries did the same thing. It had some legislation to give effect to that. And that is why, to this day, in Guernsey and some other jurisdictions, we have two twin-track regimes for drug trafficking proceeds and other proceeds. Because after the Vienna Convention was enacted, people began to think, well, hang on, why is it just drugs? Aren't there other crimes we should be worried about? And so then you've got the whole concept of the all crimes regime, and Guernsey enacted the process of crime law, which covered all other crimes. That's why there are two regimes. That's the only reason for it. Logically now, there's no real reason for it. It's just historical. And one day we'll probably get round to amalgamating into one regime, but it's just a question of time and priorities. And the system currently functions, so it's not something that anyone's agitating for. But that is a historical reason why we have this twin track regime. The UK had the same thing. So did Jersey and Isle of Man. I think some of them now combined in one regime, but we haven't yet. But that's the reason. So that was the late 80s when it kicked off. Then in 1989, the G7 countries and the EU created a body called the Financial Action Task Force, which was a global body that put together standards that countries had to comply with, because the international community realised it's one thing to have a convention saying we need to tackle this, but you need to have some sort of process for setting standards of what you expect people to have in place and measures against which you can judge them to see if they're doing it or not. And so the Financial Action Task Force was born. That is a body made up of all the sort of leading countries of the world. So you've got the United States, you've got Britain, you've got all the big countries that belong to it. And it issues recommendations. They're called recommendations, but don't let deceive you, they're not really optional. The FATF recommendations are effectively compulsory standards against which all countries are judged. If you fail to meet those standards, you'll be criticised internationally. And not only that, but punitive measures can be put in place. So, for example, they'll issue a statement saying anyone dealing with this country must do enhanced CDD, extra due diligence measures, and the effect of that will be to cripple your economy. It makes the frictional cost of doing business there much more expensive, and people won't do business with you. So that's why Guernsey has always bent over backwards to try to have a high level of compliance with FATF standards. If we don't do that, we'll be shut down very quickly. So, although they're called recommendations, they're not really, they're sort of mandatory. If you want to find them, they're easy to find. They're online. They look like this, and there are 40 of them. Initially, they just dealt with money laundering. Then we had 9/11, and the international community decided they needed to include terrorist financing, and that's where terrorism enters the story for international standards, because then they realised that there was no unified approach to handling terrorist financing. So, what is terrorist financing? Well, terrorist financing is two things. Direct terrorist financing, which, as you would imagine, is raising money to fund acts of terrorism, to pay for terrorism training, to pay for promotion of terrorist ideology. But it's also indirect funding, which means giving money to terrorist organisations for legitimate purposes, to pay their rent, buy them food, whatever, because that then frees up their other assets to use for terrorist purposes. And that's why international standards on terrorist financing are really quite draconian and prevent you making money available of any kind for any purpose to people who are known to be involved in terrorism. And more recently, we've seen a development which is to do with paying travel costs. The concept of foreign terrorist fighters has arisen, and so now it's a criminal offence in Guernsey and in many other jurisdictions to pay the travel costs for somebody, even if that person hasn't yet committed any crime. If they want to travel to Syria in order to support a terrorist activity, you cannot pay their travel. So that's a perfectly lawful purchase, normally paying someone's airfare, but not if it's for the purpose of going to support terrorist ideology. So the net for terrorist activities regarded as linked to terrorism is widening all the time. So that is essentially money laundering and terrorist financing. The fundamental difference between the two is that money laundering is much easier to detect. It's not easy to detect, I'd say that, but it's much easier to detect than terrorist financing, because the key issue is, where does that money come from? And there'll be an audit trail. You can go back, with any asset, you can go back and see where it came from. With terrorist financing, the issue, unless it's come from a criminal purpose, criminal origin, the issue is always going to be, where is that money going? What's it going to be used for? Well, obviously, that's a much harder thing to determine. You can't look into the future. So you have to look for red flags and other things that suggest to you why it might be that people would want to use this money for terrorist purposes. And that's really very, very difficult to do. Every jurisdiction struggles with that. If you look at statistics for any country, they'll have a certain level of statistics for money laundering and for terrorist financing, and there's normally an enormous gulf. I mean, Guernsey had very few cases of even any reports. We had a suspicion of TF, no cases of it at all. The UK, the same story, pretty much everywhere the same story, because terrorist financing is very, very hard to determine. Because people aren't going to come in and say, can you please transfer some money for me? I've got a mate who's working for ISIL and I want to give him some money. But obviously no one's going to say that. They're going to have some cover story. And because you can't track back to verify it, again, as you can with money laundering, the proceeds, it's very, very hard to see if that's accurate or not. So that's fundamentally the difference between the two. So where does Guernsey fit into all this? Well, Guernsey is not a member of the FATF, unsurprisingly, unsurprisingly, that's all the big countries. But what has happened over time is that a network has grown up around the world of what are called FATF-style regional bodies, and FSRBs, to use a jargon. And those are bodies which basically implement the FATF recommendations in that the same way, but they're made up of countries that aren't members of the FATF. So there's one for Europe, which is Moneyval, there's one in South America, one for Africa, one for the Middle East, all different parts, one for the Caribbean. They've got names, different acronyms or names that are similar. There's FATF Caribbean, there's Middle Eastern Network, all sorts of things like that. The European one is Moneyval. And Guernsey, Jersey and the Isle of Man joined Moneyval in 2018. And as a result of that, we are subject to the evaluation processes of Moneyval. And the way that works is it's called a mutual evaluation process. So if it's a FATF country, FATF will put together a team of evaluators drawn from each of the countries and member states to go and look at a particular country and assess it. It's also a mutual evaluation process onto Moneyval and other FSRBs. Basically, they put together a team of evaluators drawn from their members who then go to the country and assess it for compliance with the same FATF recommendations as everybody else. So we are judged against the FATF standards, or we're just judged by Moneyval rather than by FATF itself. So is everyone with me so far? I don't want to go too fast on it, but it's a lot of job.
What year was that?
2012. Sorry, if I said I didn't, I'm sorry, I apologise, it's 2012. Before that, though, we have been evaluated because not all countries belong to the FATF or an FSRB. So countries who want to show they are clean to the international community who don't belong to a body like that can invite, and have often do invite in, external bodies like the IMF or the World Bank to assess them, produce a report for them that they can show the world. And Guernsey did that in 2003 and in 2010 we had the IMF in. We got evaluated again against the FATF recommendations, but by an IMF team. So we've been evaluated now 3 times. 2003 by IMF, 2010 by the IMF, and 2014 by Moneyval.
The 2 earlier evaluations, were the earlier evaluations Guernsey's applications to join them?
No, that was done because basically there are lots of things that happen internationally where we might want to sign up to something and people will say, well, you can't sign up unless you're satisfied you've got a good AML regime. And the way you prove that is saying, here, I've been evaluated, look at this, brilliant recommendations, done really well. And that's why they did it. Now, the reason we joined Moneyval was because in 2010, I think it was around about that time, just after the IMF evaluation, if I remember, the FATF changed its criteria for putting countries on a grey list that it might want to impose special measures for. And one of the criteria was if you are not subject to interim follow-up between your evaluations. Evaluations are roughly every 4 years. If you belong to the FATF or an FSRB, one of these bodies, there is a follow-up process that goes with that membership. If you don't belong to one, there is no process for you to be in a follow-up. There's no system internationally for someone to come and follow up between your evaluation and check you've taken steps to address recommendations last time round. So what that meant was that Guernsey, Jersey, Isle of Man and Gibraltar were looking at being put on the FATF grey list, not because we had any deficiencies in our processes, we didn't, but because we were not, there was no one coming in doing an interim follow-up that we could point to and say, look, we've been followed up, therefore don't put us on the grey list. And we took the view that even if we got on the grey list, we'd probably get out of it eventually because we have got very good systems. They came and looked at us closely. But why expose yourself to that? And one of my colleagues says, in his view, it's a bit like your tie going into a machine. If you flick it out straight away, there's no damage done. If you start getting sucked into it, it's much, much harder to extricate yourself, and they start looking at other things, they get mission creep, all sorts of things happen. So the view was, let's not go anywhere near that grey list, let's join an FSRB, and therefore we'll get a follow-up process that we can point to, and we won't get on that FATF grey list. That's what we joined Moneyval. So, well, it would have been, we could have joined another one if they'd accepted us, but it would be very difficult to justify joining a Caribbean one or one for South America. I mean, the August one was Moneyval. in some ways, it would have made more sense to join a Caribbean one from a legal perspective, because most of the Caribbean jurisdictions have a legal system much closer to our own, which are derived from a UK common law system. And in Moneyval, most of the countries are civil law jurisdictions. I'll come on in a moment to membership of Moneyval, but that would have been an option, but it would just look very, very strange if they even accepted us. I can't recall what their membership criteria is, but I'm sure it's got the geographical element. I don't know they've accepted us. It would look very bizarre to the rest of the world. So we've joined a Caribbean assessment body. And there's also the issue that we don't necessarily want to be closely associated with Cayman Islands, BVI, places like that necessarily, because we always try and draw a distinction between the level to which we comply, the Crown dependency to comply with international standards, and some of those, not all, but some of those other jurisdictions. So it wouldn't have made any sense for us to join one of those other bodies. So we joined Moneyval. So what is Moneyval? Apart from being an FSRB, it is a committee of the Council of Europe, which is set up to address money laundering issues. And it is basically made up, the vast majority of Moneyval members are former Soviet bloc countries. And there are also a few microstates like us, like Andorra, like Monaco, that don't fit in, aren't big enough to be members of the FATF. So probably the biggest country in Moneyval, I would say, is Poland, which, if the FATF are being started now, would probably be a FATF member. But because it wasn't at the time when the FATF came out, the Eastern Bloc were just emerging from the Iron Curtain. All those Eastern Bloc countries end up in Moneyval. Yeah, well, basically, but it's slightly wider than that. But essentially, yeah, it's all the big players. The big players that were not at the time behind the Iron Curtain. But Russia's a member of FATF. Israel is a member of Moneyval. Doesn't fit naturally there, but if you think about it, the alternative would have been joining the Middle Eastern network, and they'd have been evaluated by all the Arab countries. And for some reason, they weren't keen on that, so they joined Moneyval. We had the Holy See. There's quite interesting places actually. The Holy See. Andorra, Monaco, San Marino, lots of small jurisdictions, but all have very different legal systems and tied to different big countries. So one of the issues for us is that when we're evaluated, it can be a bit of a challenge to explain to the evaluators how our legal system works. They don't really get it. Civil lawyers expect everything to be much more written down. Concepts like reasonableness, reasonably practicable, which are obviously the mainstay of our legal system, they don't really get that. So often can be quite hard work to convince them all that it works. But we did do it last time, I remember going to a meeting to talk to industry about what had happened and how the evaluation had gone. By which time we had all the ratings, which are fantastic. And someone said to me, "Oh, this is stacked against us. You know, this is not fair. It's stacked against us because we're not a civil law jurisdiction." Well, hang on, they've just given us the best report they've ever given any country in the world. So to say it's stacked against us was slightly be a difficult one to run with any credibility. How can you say that? So people often have misconceptions, I think, about how it works. But it is basically an evidence-based process. That's the other thing people don't realise. That people think, oh, if you're evaluated by, I don't know, a French evaluator, they're out to get us. The French hate us as a financial system. But it's a very heavily evidence-based process. You have to go through every recommendation that's underneath it, a methodology, sort of criteria you've got to pick off. If you make findings that are not supported by evidence, you have to justify that in a plenary. It's voted down. It's much, much more rigorous than people realise. So, for example, in our last evaluation, we had a Russian evaluator. And someone said to me, well, how's that going to work? They'll be out to do us down. But he was fantastic. He was actually in the plenary arguing to get some more ratings up in other areas that he wasn't even evaluating on, because he was a very fair-minded person who knew the process very well and could see that we had actually complied with a whole range of areas. So it is not a political process at all. I mean, politicians aren't involved in it. It's basically practitioners who work in these areas every day, who understand how systems work. And if they see a system working and they see a legal framework working, they'll give you credit for that. The challenge can be just to make it clear that that's what's happening. That's a different issue. So membership of Moneyval brought with it that evaluation process. It also meant that people from Guernsey would then be expected, as a condition of membership, to take part in evaluations ourselves, as well as evaluation teams. So a number of people from the Guernsey authorities have trained as evaluator. I was a part of the evaluation team for Bosnia. Someone from the GFSC evaluated Andorra and just done Malta. Richard Walker from the Policy and Resources Committee has done, I think, more evaluations than anyone else in the world. He's done lots of them. So Guernsey does definitely play a very, very full part in the international community, what's called the global network, which is the FATF and all the FSRBs underneath it. So Guernsey is very, very fully signed up to So has anybody got any questions at this stage?
Why didn't they just let the smaller jurisdictions use it?
Well, we're not members of the G. We're not members of the G7 or G20.
Okay,
No, that's it.
and that's
No, but they're the ones set up. It's their organisation in conjunction with the EU. So we're not members of the EU or of. Yes, that's right. You can apply. So Israel, for example, is currently applying to join FATF. You can apply if you meet certain criteria, but we'll never do that. No, that's why they set up these bodies, to make sure that everyone else is joining. Because otherwise, you'd have all the big countries doing that and lots of rogue states doing nothing and not having any comeback for it. So that's why they set up all these bodies.
Well, we're talking credit actually
Money and then VAL. Yeah.
What does it stand for? What does the VAL stand for?
Oh, that's just a word they made up. I think it's evaluation. So
Oh,
just money val. It doesn't mean anything particularly. It's just a name, rather than having another acronym. Lots of others got acronyms, but they just went for that. And Moneyval meets in Strasbourg 3 times a year. Have a plenary there 3 times a year, and we're expected to go along and vote in evaluation discussions, that kind of thing. I'm the Guernsey representative for Moneyval, so I have to go to all the plenaries, but also we take others with us as well, because there are basically three disciplines covered by the FATF standards. There's legal, so the bit I cover. There is law enforcement, so that's actually investigating and investigating criminality. And then there is supervisory. So people have oversight for regulatory bodies like the GFSC. So we normally take along a team of people from each of those disciplines, so that when there are issues to be discussed, we've got all the range of expertise to draw on. We only get one representative. The other countries get 3 representatives, 1 for each discipline. We don't, because our membership is slightly complicated. Because we're not members of the Council of Europe, we had to apply through the EU, through the UK's membership. And the UK, under the statute of Moneyval, it's possible for countries who are Council of Europe members to apply the countries for whom they are responsible for foreign policy to sit in their seat. And because basically Jersey, Guernsey, and the Isle of Man were all sitting in the UK seat, they said you can have 1 member each. So you get 1 official representative each, but we take along other observers. Gibraltar is an interesting one. Gibraltar applies to join at the same time, and basically Spain blocked it. So that's a lot of negotiation, and they only joined last year as a result of lots of ongoing ins and outs between Spain and the rest of the Council of Europe and the UK. A lot of negotiation, but Gibraltar are now members as well.
They didn't find themselves in the
No, they haven't been evaluated yet by.
okay. They didn't go on the.
Oh, I see. You mean, no, they didn't. No. Yeah. Yes, Spain, all the big countries are members of FATF. Spain is a member of FATF, but Spain is also a member of the Council of Europe. Yeah, yes, because the Council of Europe has to agree people joining Moneyval, and obviously all the main European countries, even if they're not in Moneyval themselves, are members of the Council of Europe. And so Spain basically vetoed Gibraltar joining Moneyval for quite a long time, and then managed to. There was a lot of behind the scenes negotiation, and then they finally joined last year. So we've now got 4 of us sitting there at the back of the room, these small jurisdictions that are sitting basically in the UK seat. Because like many of these bodies, there's a veto process. So they just vetoed it, but they in the end it got sorted out. I don't know what happened behind the scenes, but I know they were agitating away. We weren't involved in it, obviously. We joined by then, so we just got on with it. But that's why Gibraltar didn't join at the same time. So that's basically what happens at Moneyval, how we ended up in Moneyval. And what will happen is a report is produced, it's circulated to all the different countries. Everyone has a chance to comment on it in advance. The jurisdiction will normally come back fighting and saying, we don't agree with that rating, we think you misunderstood this, you didn't give us credit for this, blah, 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 blah. Very intensive process. Then it gets narrowed down to certain key issues that are discussed in the plenary, and the plenary has to vote on whether you think what you think. Do you agree with the evaluation team, or do you think this? And also countries themselves can say, we think you've given them too high a rating, you should bring it down. So it's a very intense process. When we had our evaluation in 2014, the amount of hours went into that you would not believe. And it was you get the report and people, you fill in a questionnaire in advance. People think, oh, it's a simple questionnaire, but it's not. Basically what that is, it's not just yes, no, I don't know. It's setting out your stall. So how do you meet this? Set out all this detailed, your legal system, how the offences work, how they fit into FATF recommendations, what cases you've had, what the vulnerabilities are, all that. And it's a massive, massive process. And then you get the report and you go back fighting on that and you say, no, that's wrong, or this, that. So we've basically fought like tigers, but we got a fantastic outcome with only 1 fail rating, and most countries get 20 maybe. So we did pretty well overall. But that's because we have a huge advantage, which is that the evaluation process is in English, and countries that don't speak English. When I did the Bosnia evaluation, for example, every conversation was through an interpreter, which makes it much, much harder for everybody. And you lose the edge of your attack, really, if you're doing it in that way. So we have a huge advantage in the process. So that's one reason why we've always done well. But also Guernsey has always been very, very committed to this, because as an international financial centre, which is our only real generation of income, essentially, we know that if we come on the wrong side of this, we've had it. This couldn't like Vienna for the whole of the jurisdiction. So Guernsey's always been very committed to throwing everything it's got at the best possible outcome for an evaluation process. So, sorry.
So 3 plenary sessions a year.
Yeah.
And each plenary session, and you do 1 evaluation.
It's normally 1 report. Sometimes it's 2 if they've got one, but it's normally 1 because that takes like a day and a half of discussion. And there are other things. You get presentations about developments in the world of money laundering, where there's a whole lot of other areas. Then you get follow-up sessions. People are in follow-up. So a jurisdiction was evaluated last year will come back and report on what they've done to meet the recommendations. And you have to rule on whether they've made sufficient progress or whether they have to go and enhance follow-up. And there's lots of different. It's quite bureaucratic, and it's a lot of process to go through.
So then I guess it's like a rolling yearly 3 evaluations for a month.
Yeah.
It comes around and
Every 4 years or so, yeah, yes, yeah, that's right. Yes.
So we're playing around with that too.
Well, that's a good question. Moneyval's having problems with resources at the moment. It's a very expensive process to fund the evaluation, so it's getting put back. So ours probably won't be until 2020, 22, something like that. So it's quite a big gap from our last one. But that's because the process of change evaluation is far more time intensive. It's taking longer, so people are there's a sort of gap now developing between more than the 4-year gap period, I'd say.
And why is it a funding issue?
Actually, I shouldn't really say that. Sorry, I won't say any more about that because I'm sure that's not meant to be common knowledge. So please don't repeat that. I can't say any more about it. I shouldn't have said that. I just suddenly thought. Yeah. Sorry. Anyway.
I didn't hear anything.
No. Okay, so that's basically the context for Guernsey. That's how Guernsey fits in to the international money laundering world, if you like, at a evaluation level. Like I said, if we didn't do well in that and we ended up with a bad outcome, what then happens, you get pushed into this process where you are put in a pool of countries. This is a different grey list now from one we'd won for not being evaluated. And you have to go back and report to FATF at this stage. So you're back in front of the big players, the big guys suddenly, explaining to the FATF why it is you should not be subject to special measures. And this is what happened to the Isle of Man last year. The Isle of Man had a terrible evaluation report. And they ended up having spent basically the best part of 2 years throwing everything they had at trying to get out of the FATF's firing line. They'd just done it, just succeeded in doing that. But if they hadn't done that, what would have happened is a public statement would have been issued by FATF telling the world, if you want to do business in the Isle of Man, you've got to do all these extra measures, all these extra diligence. And of course, no one would have done it. That would have crucified them. So,
was it just a weakness in the laws? Do you have any insight into why they did poorly, whereas Guernsey did so well?
Well, they were evaluated under the new. We haven't yet been evaluated under the sort of new round, which is far more focused on effectiveness. The way the standards have evolved, and the evaluation process has evolved, it used to start out just looking at the legislation, and that's easy. If you've got a good system like after going through, it's quite simple. So you just used to look at your laws. Then they started looking more how you implement them, and now it's all about how many cases have you got, and that's much, much harder to deal with. And the Isle of Man were evaluated under the new round, and I think, I don't know, it's hard to say. I think they weren't fully maybe alive to how difficult it was going to be to prove effectiveness. We deliberately asked to put back. The reason we had an evaluation in 2014 was that it was under the old standards. We thought that'll buy us some time. So Guernsey and Jersey basically said to Moneyval, will you evaluate us as the last jurisdictions under the old round, under the current standards? because we knew it would buy us time. It was a hell of a lot of work then to be ready for that, but we did it. And that then meant we've been given a lot longer period to see how the new standards work. The Isle of Man went straight in under the new standards at the third jurisdiction to be done. I think it was a tactical error myself. But who knows, it might have worked. They thought we'll get this off out of the way. But anyway, they didn't. And we can learn, there's a lot of lessons to learn. But like all things, the more evaluations you see, the more you learn. So every time we go to a plenary, we come away and think, we need to do that. Okay, Lithuania got marked down for that. Do we do that? Oh, no, so you just learn and you just pick up as you go along. So the more time you've got, the easier it is to meet the standards. And if you go early, it's much harder. So that's what happened to the Isle of Man. They decided, I think for internal political reasons, they wanted to be done just as quickly. So they did it, but it sort of backfired. But they have climbed out of the FATF firing line. So hopefully,
Time you're doing some plenary sessions, someone comes out with something new and says, "We should have done that," and then everyone works out and people put some measures in there.
No,
It's subject to those frameworks that you have objective frameworks, and you then how you interpret what it says. I don't really understand.
There are frameworks, there are recommendations, and there's a methodology which asks questions. Does the jurisdiction do X, Y, Z? But within that, an evaluator will come in and will say, well, I don't think you meet that because your law says X. And then someone else will say, well, it does mean that, that's what it means. And then they'll say, well, in the evaluation of Denmark last year, their law said X and they got marked like that. So it's always looking the whole time for interpretation and with the consistency. So there is a framework, but like anything, whether or not someone there's a judgment call the whole time in whether or not someone if it's just technical, does the law say X, that's easy. But if it's slightly more complicated than that, or it's, what rating do you give to somebody because they've only got 4 cases? Is that a fully compliant rating? Is that partially compliant? There's a judgment call to be made. And then people fight about that. That's where the battle is normally fought, the rating that's been assigned. And people then look at other countries and say, well, hang on, they only have 3. And the FATF evaluated this country and they gave them this. So why haven't we got that? So you get that sort of discussion the whole time.
When you say how many cases they have, what kind of cases do you
Well, how many prosecutions, how many money laundering prosecutions have you had in the last 4 years? Let's look at your statistics. You've never had any, right? You clearly have not got an effective system.
Yeah, just because you haven't got any prosecution, there's nothing about it.
Well, no,
if anything, you might as well say that.
It might say that, but if you've got billions of pounds going through your system every year, that's not going to be credible. I mean, the fact is, if you're an international financial centre and you've got assets that have been frozen at the request of other jurisdictions who are carrying out investigations in those jurisdictions, and they say, can you freeze that money in Guernsey? We think it's criminal, which happens all the time. It's quite difficult, really, to say, well, that money ends up here totally innocently. You can argue that, and we have argued that. Trust me, we've argued that till we're blue in the face. But actually, it's quite difficult to do that if you say, well, someone accepted that money, somebody opened a bank account for that person, somebody set up a trust company here for that person. Now, maybe that was entirely naive or negligent or whatever, but maybe it wasn't. So if you've got no cases at all, it's very difficult to argue any credibility your system is working, because you would expect there to be at least some. I'm not saying we have got cases. I'm not saying we've got no cases. Yeah, exactly. Yeah, exactly. Yes.
Using injunction or whatever in relation to reported funds within 30 days. Whereas in Guernsey, you don't have to, as soon as you make a report, the DFIs can just sit on the report and not do anything. And the money can't be moved unless you open yourself to a prosecution. So the system is completely different in Guernsey to the UK, where in the UK, it's almost like the law enforcement has to bring a case, whereas in Guernsey, you can protect those funds in the same way without doing anything at all.
So I'm not sure what your point is, though.
So that by default in the UK, you're more likely to have cases because there's an obligation on law enforcement to bring cases and to freeze funds, whereas in Guernsey, you can effectively achieve the same thing without actually being to court.
And the freezing of funds is not the same thing as having a prosecution. You can't confiscate those funds unless someone's got a conviction. And you also judge on how regularly you confiscate money. So if you don't prosecute somebody, you can't invoke the confiscation regime, and therefore you can't confiscate that money. So your statistics for confiscation will be low.
Okay, so active prosecutions rather than...
I'm talking about everything. They look at all parts of the system. They say, how many prosecutions have you got? How many times does the financial supervisor go on site and inspect people. How many STRs do you get made? How many requests for assistance do you get? They look at everything. They look at the statistics across the board, and to see how your system is working. And they also look at the context. So I say, in a jurisdiction like yours, we would like to, let's say Bosnia, for example. When I evaluated Bosnia, look at Bosnia. You say, well, Bosnia has got an issue with terrorism because of its geographical location. What are your success rates in looking at terrorist cases? If you haven't got any, that's a different picture from a jurisdiction like Guernsey, which has not had neighbouring countries with terrorist problems. I mean, you've got France, there is an odd attack in France, but it's not riven with terrorism in the same way. So everything is about context. So you're judged as a jurisdiction on the context as well. So the example I gave of a financial centre not having any cases, I wasn't actually thinking of Guernsey, I was thinking of Liechtenstein, where that happened in their last evaluation. They got very, very heavily marked down, more strongly, because of all the money going through the jurisdiction. Then a country doesn't have a financial centre, where you wouldn't expect to find that kind of money laundering. You might expect to find different kind. If you've got a big domestic crime problem, people robbing banks, armed robbery, you might expect to find money laundering cases dealing with that sort of thing, but you wouldn't expect money laundering cases involving foreign criminality. There's a very different profile. So all these countries are looked at depending on their own profile. And as Julie, as you say, there's a difference between the tools available in one country and another. So you look at all of those things as well and assess the country on the basis of what its profile is. But that's how it's done. So it's essentially an attempt to understand what goes on in a country, what you'd expect to see going on if it were working well, and what the outcomes are. That's basically how it works. And that can make it difficult because you can't always compare apples with oranges. You can't just say, well, this country got this and we got this, we want the same thing, because then the evaluator will say, well, that's because their profile's different. So it's always an argument, like anything else. And if anyone's ever seen any international bodies, you'll understand that flags kind of going up, hang on, I support them on this, so I don't agree with that. Well, it's a mass of different views, but ultimately at the end you have to reach consensus, and that's the basis of it. If you can't reach consensus, the report wouldn't be approved. So that's how reports get to the plenary.
So when we do them investigations, searching site visits,
Yeah. Yeah, they come over and they'll ask the jurisdiction to nominate people from all different areas of commercial life. So last year, people who work in banks, who work in law practices, people who work in estate agents, anyone that's covered by the framework. I'll come on in a moment to what the recommendations cover, but anyone that comes within the recommendation framework, they'll ask to meet. And they'll come and talk to the prosecutors, they'll come and talk to law enforcement, they'll go and talk to GFSC, they'll go with everybody, and they'll ask lots and lots of questions. And then they'll go away and do a draft report and then show it to us, and we hold our hands over horror and say, this is totally wrong, or not. So that's basically the international framework. And we've got any more questions before we move on to what the recommendations cover? No, okay. Well, basically, the easiest way I would say to understand how the international money laundering terrorist financing standards work is to think of them in two halves: preventive measures and repressive. And the preventive measures are all the measures that are there to try to stop the systems being used, anyone's country's systems being used for money laundering or terrorist financing purposes. And the repressive measures are the measures that kick in when it has been abused. So on the preventive side, you've got all the frameworks for money laundering regulation, CDD, all these measures to stop people using the system. Repressive side, you've got criminal offences, you've got asset recovery measures to claw back criminal process within the system. So that's roughly how it breaks down. And in the context of the Guernsey Bar exam, the ethics paper, you need to understand the preventive side, because there's a dedicated preventive regime applicable to lawyers. And the repressive side comes in on the criminal paper. Those of you who are doing the criminal paper will need to know all about the different offences, asset recovery measures, the consent regime that Julia mentioned a moment ago. That's all covered on the criminal paper, and we'll be discussing that with those of you doing that in January. On the preventive side, we'll be talking this afternoon about the specific measures that apply to lawyers. But the FATF standards have preventive measures, as you'd expect, for financial services businesses. So there's a whole list of businesses that have to be covered that are defined in the FATF recommendations. So what you'd expect: banks, investment companies, insurance companies, money lenders, remitters, you know, everyone dealing with financial products in some way is covered by the FATF standards, financial services businesses. And then there are what's called designated non-financial business and professions, DNFBPs, put the list on, they're on the list. And those are businesses aren't financial services businesses, which are considered to be in the front line of, or the second rank for money laundering risk. So that's lawyers, accountants, estate agents, casinos, and dealers in high value goods, precious metals, and so forth. So every country is expected to have a regime in place for preventive measures for financial services businesses, but also for DNFBPs. But I should say, when I say lawyers, it doesn't mean any kind of legal work. It means only lawyers doing transactional work, the kind of work that is thought to be vulnerable to money laundering. And this is a very common mistake in the bar exam, and actually generally a common mistake of perception. I'd say for most people think, oh, I'm a lawyer, I need therefore to comply with the money laundering framework. But if you're not doing transactional work, you don't need to do that. The legal basis for all of this is in the Process of Crime Law. Schedule 1 lists the financial services businesses that are covered, and Schedule 2 covers the DNFBPs. So in that, legal work is defined. If you look at it, I put it in the study guide, but if you look at Schedule 2, it just lists the kind of work that's covered, and it's basically things that involve handling client money, securities, shares. Let's find it. Yeah, the acquisition or disposal of interest in real property, the management of client money, securities or other assets, the management of banks, savings and securities, the organisation of contributions for the creation, operation, management or administration of companies or legal persons, legal arrangements. So it's that kind of work. So if you're doing litigation, you don't need to comply with the preventive measures, except in one respect, which I'll mention in a moment. So we have in Guernsey a preventive regime for all those organisations. Now, there are no casinos in Guernsey other than the ordinary e-casino, and that has its own dedicated regime under ordinary legislation. That's not within the scope of this exam, so we don't have to worry about that. We'll just be aware that it exists. And that has the same sort of measures we find applicable to financial services businesses and accountants, lawyers and other DNFBPs. In terms of dealers in precious metals and goods, we don't have a regime for them. What we have instead, because the standards require them to be regulated if they're accepting monies over a certain threshold, where we deal with that in Guernsey is making a criminal offence for them to accept cash over a certain figure. And therefore we don't use that, therefore we're outside the regulatory regime, because no one in Guernsey is dealing in those things accepting cash, which is where the vulnerability is thought to be.
Sorry, could you repeat that?
Yeah, for precious metals and goods, we have created some regulations under the Process of Crime Law which basically make it a criminal offence to accept cash payments for those goods over a certain threshold. I think it's £10,000 from memory. And that means, therefore, there is nobody in Guernsey who can accept cash for those payments who then come within the FATF recommendations. We don't need a regulatory regime for them because they just cannot accept, it's illegal to accept cash over that threshold. Therefore, the FATF, you don't come in the definition for FATF purposes. That was the easier way to do it than have a whole new regulator for jewellery shops and things, which would be impractical. So that's something we've done that. So that leaves lawyers, accountants, estate agents, and they are covered by a dedicated regime for prescribed business. They're called prescribed businesses. That's just the title given to that regime, but the prescribed business regulations. And that regime mirrors the regime for financial services businesses. So that is essentially the background. But in addition to preventive measures that I've described, we also have a regime, for example, for registration of charities. Some of you may have come across, and non-profit organisations. Again, the reason we have that is that's an obligation of the FATF standards. You don't need to know about that for the exam, but just be aware that it's there, and that's why it's there. So if ever you wonder why we have these frameworks and why they're defined the way they are, it's pretty much always to meet the FATF standards. So, for example, the language used to define lawyers and legal services in the Process of Crime Law is lifted directly from the definitions in here. So we can say to anyone evaluating us, if they say, well, you don't cover all the businesses, we do, because the wording is exactly the same. That's why we've done it like that. NPOs and charities, so there's framework for them as well. Charities are thought mainly to be a risk for terrorist financing rather than for money laundering, because you often hear cases of charitable donations and organisations' funds being diverted internationally to fund terrorist activity. Not really a risk for Guernsey. If you look at the profile of our charities, it's mainly very small, locally based groups running social and sports activities. But even so, we need to show we've got a framework in place. We have a registration regime for them. So that is essentially the sort of background. So if you think about the regime we have, so half it's preventive and half it's repressive. So that's basically how it fits together. So has anyone got any questions at this point? No, okay. That's a good or a bad sign.
Really, really interesting.
Well, my husband wouldn't say that. Not money laundering. Don't talk money laundering again, please.
Well, this is the first time I've ever been spoken about it.
Yeah, well, thank you. I think people, it's one of those things that I wouldn't say simply we do it because we have to, but that is basically the reality of it. But people don't really think about it because it's not something that's on people's radar as an obvious crime. So, and they say it wasn't criminal anywhere in the world until about 10 years ago. So it's only one of those things that people, we do it because we have to internationally, but most people don't see it on a day-to-day basis, particularly in jurisdictions like Guernsey, which is a very, very low domestic crime rate. You don't really think about
Well, I
protein
think
crime.
also for us as practitioners, it's a chore. Just knowing a little bit about the history actually just makes it much more tangible.
Yeah, well, that, I mean, it is a chore. We do it because we have to. Like I say, people often say, you often get from industry, why are we being forced to do this? So being gold plating, blah, 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 blah. But it's because we have to. We're not doing it because we want to make life difficult. But I think if you don't understand the reason for it,
Well, for
don't really
example,
understand.
just knowing that the reason why we have a drug one and in general everything else regime, I didn't know that was because the drug one first.
Yeah, it's just
War on
historical.
drugs and then presumably.
Yeah, that was the reason, yeah. Now, I mentioned a moment ago, there's one area of preventive measures which are not confined to transactional lawyers, and that is reporting of suspicion. The suspicious reporting rate, transaction reporting regime under the is in the disclosure law for money laundering and the terrorism crime law for terrorist financing reporting, but it's the same regime essentially. You have to make a report of suspicion. Because this part of the framework kind of straddles repressive and preventive, I would say, in a way, because one of the other requirements of the FATF recommendations is every country has to have a financial intelligence unit, an FIU, to use the jargon, to which you have to make reports of suspicion of money laundering or terrorist financing. And in Guernsey, and that FIU can be, the FATF recognises various models. It can be administrative, a standalone agency, which is not a law enforcement agency, and they just analyse material, pass it on to law enforcement. Or it can be embedded within law enforcement. That's what we've got in Guernsey, same as in the UK. In the UK, it's the National Crime Agency, which is the law enforcement body. Here, it is the Financial Intelligence Service, which sits within the Guernsey Border Agency, so which is a law enforcement body. So we have a law enforcement FIU, which is the FIS, and reports of suspicion get made to that body, and then they are disseminated to other countries if they're involved in the report, and also used internally, passed on to investigators to see if there's a criminal act that gives rise to. Obviously, not every case does that. We get lots and lots and lots of STRs or SARs, special activity reports, suspicious transaction reports. Both terms are used. Some people call them STRs, some people say SARs, because they don't always involve an actual transaction. It becomes to be people making inquiries, might be suspicious. So we prefer to call them SARs, it's a bit wider, but it's essentially the same thing. And those SARs are fed into law enforcement, who then want to investigate whether there's a criminal act underpinning it.
Why is it not integrated into police? Why is that? Why did it become part of?
Oh, the GBA. Well, when it was set up, it was essentially made up of police officers and customs officers, and it was integrated, an integrated unit within. It sat within the GBA. I had to go somewhere. They sat in the GBA. They took officers from the police, and in fact, the first head of the FS, I think, was a police officer. It alternates. And the reason they did that was because drug trafficking is probably the only serious offence that generates proceeds in Guernsey. We don't have other kinds of criminality, and drug trafficking investigation is responsibility of customs, Guernsey Border Agency. So they had expertise in that area, and the police fraud department were more experienced at financial crimes. The two sort of came together and they created a unit, a joint of both law enforcement bodies that sat within the GBA. But the reporting obligation applies to everybody who acquires suspicion in the course of a business. It's not just businesses that are covered by the preventive measures. And again, that's another common mistake. People think, well, I'm not doing transactional work, therefore I don't have to report suspicion. But that's not true. It applies to every form of business. We've had reports of, we had one case, a milkman making a report of suspicion once. Everyone who acquires suspicion in the course of a business has to make a report to the FIS. And that includes what are called attempted transactions. And that doesn't mean you tried to transfer some money and the system crashed, it didn't go. That's not what we're talking about. Attempted transactions in the international context means the typical pattern is someone will come and see you and they'll say, I'm interested in setting up a company to hold assets on blah, 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 whatever. And you say, okay, well, can you tell us, give us your identity document, do some CDD, ask some questions, what's the purpose of it? And they then say, actually change my mind, I'm not going to do it. So they think we're getting a bit close. So you're not actually taking on the business of a client of yours, but the inquiries are made to you in the course of business. And that is regarded internationally as an attempted transaction. And you should make a report of suspicion, even if you didn't take the business on. You should still report that to the FIS, because that's suspicious activity. And that's why I say we talk about SARS rather than STRs, because no transaction was involved, but there was suspicious activity. You start asking somebody, and the reason is if we don't include that, then that person will keep going around, and then the authorities don't know that this is going on. So it's all an attempt to get as much information as possible to prevent the system being used for nefarious purposes. Okay, well that is basically the background. This afternoon I'm going to go on to talk about the framework for lawyers, the preventive framework in a bit more detail. So we've got a bit of time now if anyone wants to ask any more questions. I'll be here I think for another, we've got another hour actually, but we won't need it, but unless you want to talk about any more detail. But that's essentially what I wanted to cover this morning, just to give you the setting, the background, the framework that we have. So then, have got any more questions?
This is really boring, but you said earlier that you, in your study guide, you concluded the legislation, and I just wondered which thing that is.
So which legislation do you mean, sorry?
When you were talking about legislation, and I think it's not.
I think it's in the ethics paper.
No, this isn't exactly helpful questions.
No, it's all right. I'm pretty sure I put it in the ethics paper. Yeah, if you look on page 6. Yeah, I just extracted the bit that relates to lawyers because that's what's relevant here. So rather than making you go and look at the whole thing, I just put it in there to make it easy for you. And I referred, therefore, I then used the language in the rest of the document of transactional lawyers, which refers back to lawyers that come within that kind of work. But that does remind me of another point I should make, though, which is that it's important to bear in mind as well that the nature of work can change. And there are two things that I think you need to bear in mind, particularly if you're doing litigation, that you won't have to do the CDD stuff and all that kind of thing because you're not covered by the preventive measures. But quite often what happens is then that when a case is, let's say a case is settled and the settlement is being put together, that can involve transactional work. And at that point, you need to be alive to the fact that at that stage, you do need to start complying with the money laundering framework. And it's very easy to lose sight of that. And I understand from talking to colleagues in private practice that it can slip through the gaps if you're not very careful, because when you pass it, you may have to pass it over to someone else in your firm. If you're litigating, you say, well, I don't know about structuring, whatever, so I'll pass it over to you to handle that side of things. And that they will assume that you've done client take-on because they do it as a matter of course. They won't necessarily be alive to the fact that litigation, you haven't done that. So they may assume that's happened. So just be aware, if a case is passed over to you to help structure a litigation settlement, that you make sure that the CDD has been done, because you may not have thought about that. That's one issue. And the other is, as well, that even outside the context of settlement, someone may just say to you, you did a really good job on that case for me, would you mind acting for me and take over this company? So they're the existing client, they have not been onboarded, to use a jargon, because they were doing a different kind of work. So you need to make sure every time that constantly check that it hasn't evolved into transactional work. And whether or not you need to do the CDD, I've been told a good tip if you're a litigator and you're not sure whether you're moving to the area of transactional work to structure the settlement, let's say, is look at who you are having to get help from in your firm. If you've got to go to a corporate department and say, actually, can you help me with this? That will tell you that it's something that probably needs CDD and everything else to go with it. So that's it for this morning, unless someone's got anything else they want to talk about.
You like Strasbourg?
Sorry?
You like Strasbourg?
I did it for last week, yeah. Actually, it's quite scary because I was there literally the plenary was the week before last. So I was literally there the week before the shooting in exactly the same locations in the Christmas market. That was pretty scary. That was scary. Where do I eat?
No.
There's some regular recommendations. Yeah. We meet in the Council of Europe building, but Palais de Europe is called. Great big building. Well, that's a very good topic. We've got an article. I haven't got enough time actually, but I'll run you through a few places. Yeah, no, the food is fantastic. It's great. It's a very sociable thing because you have lots of different. There's lots of networking companies that go on. So we always have a small jurisdictions dinner, and we get together and discuss problems that microstates have in meeting all these standards and whatever. And then you have a meeting of different groups, and then you might be on an evaluation team to have another dinner, and it's very it's good fun. I think it is anyway. Not everyone will agree with that. But okay, well, I think that's it for now. So we'll make a start this afternoon on ethics, and we'll just go through the guide on the different parts of the framework that you have to comply with. And everyone's happy with that? Well, I'm happy to, if you want to do that, yeah. I don't think we'll finish it in an hour though. Yeah, okay, fine. Yeah, okay, that's fine by me. Yeah, that's fine by me. Yeah. Yeah.
Otherwise, we just have a
No, that makes sense to me. That's fine by me. Oh yes, thank you. Okay, so let's get into the preventive regime for lawyers. So, as I've mentioned, we have a preventive regime under the process of crime law for financial services businesses and for prescribed businesses, which is transactional lawyers, accountants, and estate agents. The two regimes are effectively identical, as you'll have seen if you've ever looked at them or applied them. And they are there to prevent money laundering and terrorist financing. Now, although we have three different enactments, if you like, we've got the money laundering, the process of the crime law, the drug trafficking law, both which cover money laundering offences, and the terrorism crime law. It's all made under the process of the crime law. There is not a VARIS issue, in fact, though, because for the purposes of the regulations, money laundering is defined as including offences under the process of the crime law, offences under the drug trafficking law, and terrorist financing offences. That's so. In case you're wondering, well, where's the terrorism regime? It's all done together, and it's done by defining money laundering for the purposes of these regulations. That's covering all those areas. Everything is included. The fact there's a bifurcation regime for drugs and other crimes doesn't really affect, so it doesn't really have any impact on the preventive measures. It does affect the criminal side because they're two different criminal systems, but we'll come on to that on the criminal paper. But for your purposes today, for the preventive regime, the fact there are different measures doesn't matter because they're all brought together in the definition of money laundering. So when you apply these measures, you are looking out for money laundering under both process of the crime law and drug trafficking law and terrorist financing. And the other thing is, although lawyers are not prudentially regulated by the GFSC is a designated supervisor for the legal framework for preventive measures for lawyers, because the process of the crime law enables government to designate a body to supervise. At the time when this was first put into place, there was discussion about who that would be. Would the bar put in place some kind of body to oversee legal compliance? Lots of discussion about that. But in the end, it was just decided that it was quicker and cheaper to have it all on regulators. So the GFSC supervises compliance for financial services businesses, obviously, as you'd expect, but also for lawyers, accountants, and states. That's why they are the supervisory body, but just for the AML purposes, not more widely. So other issues to do with conduct of lawyers remains responsibility of the chambre and the bar. They just supervise compliance with this. And then the other aspect of the preventive measures that applies, I mentioned this morning, is the reporting obligation, and that applies to all kinds of legal work. And if you're a litigator in particular, the areas to look out for reporting is sham litigation. That's a well recognised form of money laundering. Someone comes along and says, I'm being sued, I want you to act for me, I'll put £1 million in the client account. 2 days later, actually, I've decided to pay, I'll take the money out again, I've realised I've got no defence, so I'm going to pay out, so give me the money back. That's a well-recognised form of money laundering. So that's one area where litigators need to be aware, and that's really reported to the FIS. So, what is the regulatory framework for lawyers? Well, it's found in two places. It's found in the Prescribed Businesses Regulations and also in the handbook, the Prescribed Businesses Handbook issued by the GFSC. because in the process of the crime law, it says that the commission may make issue rules and guidance, basically, for complying with the regulations, and that is something the court will take into account if you're being when assessing whether you've complied. So if you're being prosecuted for not having complied with the regulations, because it's a criminal offence not to comply with the regulations, if you're prosecuted for that, you can say, well, the GFSE told me that the way to verify my client was to look at the passport. That's what I did. If it went wrong, I'm sorry, but I did what I was told. The court will have to take that into account if that's the guidance GFSE are giving. If it turns out you didn't in fact identify it correctly, but you followed their guidance, then that's something the court would look at. But there are exceptions for this. Like I said, it only applies to transactional work, so you don't need to do it if you're doing other forms of work. But also, even if you are doing transactional work, there are some exemptions. One is if you're working in the public sector, so Edwina's okay. And the other is if you're working in a business, a low-risk business, which is basically a business that only operates within Guernsey, does not use a bank account outside Guernsey, and has a turnover of not more than 50,000 a year, or doesn't do transactions more than 10,000 a year. Well, that's not going to apply to very many legal practices in Guernsey, so I'd be very surprised if anybody here other than Edwina would benefit from those exemptions, but just be aware that they're there. Okay, so I'd say the obligations, again, under the regime, again, sort of fall into two halves, really. One half is the obligations that are at a business-wide level. So they apply to the whole of the business activity. So things like you have to register with the GFSE if you're carrying out prescribed business. You have to carry out screening and training for your employees. You have to have corporate governance measures, and you have to put in place a system for reporting suspicions. You need to appoint somebody, a money laundering reporting officer, to whom reports of suspicion are made, and also a nominated officer for when that person's away. So you have to put those apply across the business as a whole. So that's one half, if you like, of the obligations. But the other half is specific to particular business relationship or transaction. And that means you must assess the risks attached to that transaction or relationship. You must carry out customer due diligence. You must keep records for at least 5 years, and you must monitor the relationship on an ongoing basis. Now, in the bar exam in previous years, I would say that if you've looked at some questions, you've seen yourselves that the questions in the ethics paper are nearly always to do with CDD. And that's what I want to focus on today, because that's probably also, not just from an exam point of view, that's probably kind of really at the heart of our defences against our systems being used for money laundering. Knowing who you're really dealing with and what you're being used to do. Because other things, the record keeping, the ones that all falls in the back of that, but if you've got that bit wrong, then the rest of it won't really help you very much. Keeping records, you've totally misunderstood what's going on, isn't that useful. So that's what I really want to talk about today in more detail, how CDD works. And some of you who've done it already will correct if I get anything wrong, because it's not something, as a public sector lawyer, it's not something I do in practice. So obviously there may be things I mention that are incomplete or misleading, whatever. So please speak up. I won't be offended if those of you who do it regularly want to put a different slant on it. But customer due diligence applies in 4 situations. When you're first of all establishing a business relationship, and that should be done at the outset. There are some circumstances where you can do it later, but that's normally only if it's justified because of the requirements of the business deal itself makes it necessary, and then you do CDD as soon as reasonably practical afterwards. But that's quite rare, and you'd have to convince the GFSE, let's say, or the court that it was reasonable to do that. And that there aren't very many situations really where it's almost not possible to do CDD in advance, I would say. And then the second one is when you're carrying out a transaction of over £10,000 at what's called an occasional transaction, is the language used in the regulations. That means a transaction of over £10,000 basically. And so that's outside the context of a business relationship. So it's an occasional transaction where you're actually with somebody on a one-off basis, and the money involved is more than 10 grand. And again, you have to do it at the outset for the transaction, but there is the same get out if you can show it wasn't practical for whatever reason, and then you could after that. But again, I've never really come across any situation that's been relied on. I don't know if either of you who've applied this have ever come across that situation where you have to do it later. I mean, it's hard to think really how you could really justify doing that. What situation would be so urgent that you couldn't? But yeah, I would say so. Yeah. And then irrespective of that, if you have concerns that the activity would involve money laundering or terrorist financing, you must do CDD then as well. And that applies even if some of the exemptions kick in. If you have concerns, you still have to do the CDD, even if you would otherwise be exempt. And the fourth one is when you've done all the CDD, but then you have doubts about the reliability of what you've been provided and what you've obtained, you have to go back and do more customer due diligence. So those are the 4 situations which you have to apply it. But like I say, only if you're doing transactional work. I would say one tip, I don't know how the questions are going to be set, but in my experience, the year I did the bar exam, it was clear to me, that I shouldn't say this, that the person setting the question didn't understand that the framework doesn't apply to non-transactional work, because the question was, a Nigerian PEP approaches you to ask to act in litigation, what do you do? Well, I knew the answer to that was, you don't have to do anything, it wasn't cool. I thought, if I say that, they're going to fail me, because that's clearly the CDD question. So I'll just say, be aware of that, because the way the bar, I mean, who knows, this may not be applying to the way the question is set for you, but certainly in previous years, the way it's worked, you kind of spot what the question's about, and you have to answer about that. If you don't answer that, if you answer the question strictly and don't cover that, you will fail. So I thought, what do I do here? I can't say I do. So I just said, I wouldn't do anything because it's non-transactional. However, if it was to become transactional, I would then do it. So I had to show I knew what was involved. So that's just a tip, because I'm sure it wouldn't happen this time, but I have noticed in the past people aren't always alive to that fact when they set the question. So you just be aware, this is the CDD question, to answer it on that basis. So even if it doesn't appear to be on the face of the question. Okay, so the CDD, there are 3 categories of CDD. Standard, enhanced, and simplified or reduced. And these are basically all determined on the level of risk. But standard CDD requires you to basically do 4 things. The first is establish the identity of the clients or any underlying parties or persons acting for them, including beneficial owners. So basically, you've got to drill right down to who is really behind this relationship. And that, again, isn't always easy to do, but you have to establish as much as you can whether there is someone else acting. So if you get an query, let's say from Vladimir Putin's chauffeur, about putting a large sum of money into Guernsey, that should probably put you on notice that that chauffeur may not in fact be the person who's the ultimate owner of the assets or the ultimate person behind the transaction. That's an extreme case, but obviously that's the kind of thing you're looking to get behind, who's actually doing this. And then you have to verify the identity of all these people who you've identified as being involved as either the underlying party, the client, or the person acting for the client. And using identification data, and the GFSC handbook has information there about the kind of thing you should be looking at. It's basically passports and other ID documents, good quality identification documents, basically, to make sure you're not being misled as to who the person is. You can, if the business has been introduced to you by somebody, let's say you are a bank and a lawyer says, or let's stick with lawyers, business here, but let's say a bank comes to you and says, I've got a client who wants help setting up a corporate structure. Are you willing to act for my client? I've known this person for years. You can, if that bank is a regulated Guernsey Financial Services business, you can rely on introducer information they'll give you. So if they say, I've verified the ID, here's the information, you can rely on that without doing it yourself, but you still remain responsible for CDD. So it's still your obligation to do that, but you are allowed, you can rely on that information in limited circumstances. So it's only if it's basically a domestic regulated entity or what's called an Appendix C country. And an Appendix C country is a country on list, an appendix to the handbook of countries that are regarded as having reliable AML-CFT framework. So people you would expect, like the UK and other CDs, and a few countries you might not necessarily expect to be in there, but that is another area where you can look at the information that's been provided to you. And that's one of the issues we regularly have as authorities, business saying, why can't we rely on the information from this country? And we have to weigh up, so, well, I really think they're not really that great. There are real concerns about they've made it so much easier for us to get all this business from them. Yes, but so it's one of those areas where you're constantly trying to get the balance right.
So that we could accept introduced certificates, but if you don't test the CDD, you usually fall into a trap because they don't actually.
They don't hold exactly. Yes. Yeah.
Need to have
Yeah, and you are responsible for the CDD. So yeah, so.
You can't blindly reduce it.
No, that's still your.
Your responsibility. So that's kind of a balance, trying to make it a bit easier for business to reduce the burden a bit in a way that's risk-based, but not actually driving coach and horses through the whole framework. So that's
Okay. Just to bring it back, if a local regulated bank gives you an introducer, you have to test it, or can you take it back because we're aligned regime-wise? You don't.
well, that's a judgment call, really. I mean, you're allowed to rely on it, but it's up to you. You're still responsible. So if you've got gaps in CDD, you're going to be responsible for that.
They've got gaps in their CDD, then you're responsible for the gaps.
If you rely on it, yeah. So it's up to you whether you do it or not. You can rely on it. You won't be automatically penalised by the GFC for relying on it. But if it turns out there are gaps in CDD, then you're accountable for that. The other thing you need to find out is the nature and purpose of the business relationship or transaction. And that's an interesting one, because that really, I would say, is in some ways almost more important, particularly for layering of money laundering. Because if you'll remember the layering stage is moving monies around to try and disguise what's going on. If you're being asked to move money around and there's no real reason for it, no obvious reason for it, if they can say, well, I want to create a company in Switzerland, let's say, for argument's sake, I'm just plucking jurisdictions out the air now, but because the frictional costs of creating a company there are less than they are in Guernsey, and that's true. Okay, but that makes sense why you might do that. Okay, I get that. And I want to put the money in trust because I come from a country where assets in trust, because there are forced heirship provisions. I can't leave money to my daughter, so if I put money in trust, then I can make a trust member. That's true. That makes sense. Okay, there are reasons like that you might see why someone would want to do it. Or I've got a son who's got a gambling addiction, and I'm really worried that if I don't put money in trust, when I die, it'll all be pissed against the wall. Sorry, it'll just go, dissipated very rapidly, and I want to protect those assets for the family. So if there are things like that that make business sense or commercial sense why you'd be doing it, that's one thing. If you're being asked to put in place all these structures, move money around, and there's no obvious reason for it, that should be setting off alarm bells in your mind. And why would someone do that? Why are they sending money back and forth for no obvious reason? Sending it to Jersey, then the other, and then back here again, then putting it. Why am I doing that? So that's why obtaining information on nature and purpose of business relationship transaction is so important, because that's actually, I would say, probably more likely to identify money laundering than just going to the person underlying it. Because if it's a Mr. Big criminal, yes, Carlos or Jack or whatever, you're going to know that. But most of the time you won't know that. It's not someone's obvious. It's that identification of the person isn't necessarily going to show you that. What's far more likely to show you that is if there's no business reason for the relationship or the transaction you're being asked to put into place. And the other thing you need to determine doing standard CDD is whether or not there's a PEP involved. Because if there's a PEP involved, that takes you straight into enhanced CDD. So you must ask that question at the standard stage. Yes, that's right. I'll come on to that later. I was just saying, someone asked me earlier on, actually, when we were having coffee, about the changes, because there are, I will mention at the end, but there are some changes to the regime that have just been passed literally last week. They're coming to force at the end of March. But I have been assured by those powers that be for these exams that you are not required to know that, other than the fact that it's happening. You don't need to know the detail, and you will be examined on the existing regime. So I haven't wanted to talk about changes, so I don't want to cloud the issue. I will know, you're right to rent checks, it's true, and I'll mention the fact that it's coming at the end. But in terms of what the regime says, I think it's safer to stick on the current regime for now. You don't get confused about the two, and just beware the changes coming. So like I say, when I was doing this material, I did ask them, well, are you going to examine them on the new regime? We've been forced to time the exams and what they said, no, it'll be on the regime as it was July 2018. So let's focus on that one for now. But yes, you're right, there are changes, and we'll come on to that. So if you do your CDD and find out there's a PEP, you must do enhanced CDD. So let's look at that. So as I said, that is obligatory if there's a PEP involved. Does everyone know what a PEP is? Predisposed person, which is a former politician or high-ranking official, all their family members or close associates, so it's not just them. So that if they're involved, you must do enhanced CDD, or if the case is considered to be high risk, either because of your own internal risk assessment that says it's high risk, or because it involves a jurisdiction which FATF has identified as having deficiencies in their AML framework, or it's information based on the GFSC, warnings from GFSC. The FATF point here comes back to what I was saying before about if you are somebody who's ended up with a bad evaluation outcome, this is where it will kick in, because the FATF will be saying this country has got poor AML controls, therefore we supply enhanced CDD, and that's how we can affect that in our legislation. As you can see, if we were on the receiving end of that, and someone saying, well, I've got my business, well, I go to Jersey or I go to Guernsey, or hang on, I've got to enhance CDD in Guernsey, I'm not going to go there. As simple as that. That's all it takes to shut us down. So that's the reason that measure is in there, to enable us to give, that's how we implement warnings from FATF, basically, it's through that. So you have to enhance CDD if any of those three situations apply. If it's a high risk case based on any of those sources. And what does enhanced CDD involve? Well, basically it involves the same process as the standard CDDs, except you can't use introducers here, not allowed to run an introducer certificate. You have to do all the things you do for standard CDD, but also, in addition, there are 4 other steps. I think just to go in fours, makes it easier to remember. The first is you've got to get senior management approval for the relationship or transaction. You've got to take reasonable steps to establish the source of funds or the wealth. And you can see why with PEPs that's an obvious one. If some former governor of Nigeria has got billions of pounds that's put into Guernsey, you have to wonder where that money's come from. And that's actually taken from that. We've had that situation in live cases in Guernsey and Jersey and lots of places. That's not just fanciful. So you need to establish that. You need to carry out increased monitoring of the transactional relationship and take any other steps that you think are appropriate, bearing in mind the circumstance of the particular case. So that's the enhanced stage. And then the third is reduce or simplify CDD. This is much more, much harder to, much less likely to apply. And you can only apply this. You can consider what the regulation says. You may consider applying reduce or simplify CDD if you are satisfied under your internal risk assessment that it is a low risk situation. And if you're satisfied with that and you want to consider applying reduce, simplify CDD, you then have to go to chapter 6 of the handbook, which is expressly referred to in the regulations. The regulations themselves don't set out what reduce CDD is. They direct you to the handbook, chapter 6 of the handbook. You go and look at that, and that sets out what you must do what reduce CDD means. And it essentially applies in 3 different situations. One is we've got Guernsey residents, entirely Guernsey related internal business. So the classic example gives, you know, an elderly lady wants to buy a new house. But the second one is if you have a listed legal person. Listed by that, I mean listed on a recognised stock exchange. And the reason for that is because they have their own transparency requirements. So if they're on there, there's no doubt who the beneficial owners are because they've already been through that process to get listed. And the third is if it's an Appendix C business, a business from an Appendix C country. So you can consider applying reduced CDD in those situations. So what happens if you cannot carry out?
The Appendix C Guernsey residents got a narrow exception of provision. I think for a listed legal person, the Appendix C country is converted. Do we mean what does that encapsulate? Sorry.
That means that's all the business from countries that are listed in Appendix C to the GFSC handbook. And I say those are countries that the GFSC considers to have reputable AML systems or roughly comparable to our own. So if the business is coming from there, it will have been subject to CDD in those countries, and therefore we don't need to replicate. That's broadly speaking the rationale behind it.
But why wouldn't can you give an example of when?
Well, the Isle of Man, let's say, or Jersey. If someone is doing business with the Jersey regulated financial services business. Yeah.
So it's not just any.
So a regulated entity.
Yeah, sorry, I should have put that on the slides. Yes, sorry, yes.
I just read Appendix C.
Yeah, sorry, no, I didn't make that clear. Sorry, a regulated business in an Appendix C country. Sorry, that's my mistake. Yeah. So again, you can see why business is very keen to have the list of Appendix C countries expanded, because that makes it much, much easier. But again, it's that constant tension. I mean, there were arguments at the time when the Isle had their terrible evaluations whether they could remain in the Appendix C country, but fortunately we haven't had to cross that bridge because they've pulled themselves back from it.
I can remember this anecdotal. I think in this instance, Mark, that it was basically no CDD. It was like a bank in the UK.
Yeah, you don't identify the underlying. and I can't remember that wording, chapter 6, but it says in there that basically you don't really need to do anything very much. So, what is the time? So what happens if you can't carry out CDD? Well, you won't be surprised to learn that you are not allowed to carry on with the business. So there's an existing business relationship, and let's say one of the examples I gave earlier on, you've got doubts about existing ID information, and you want to go back and get additional ones because you're concerned about it, and they can't give it to you, then you must terminate that business relationship. Or refrain, if it's one you haven't yet entered into and they won't give you the CDD, or you're not satisfied with what you've been given, you must not enter that relationship, and you must not carry out the occasional transaction the same way if you're just not satisfied with what you've been given. And you must also consider making a disclosure of suspicion to the FIS. This is what I was saying before about attempted transactions. Even if, so this is the classic scenario, someone approaches you, you ask a few questions, they then back off. You think, well, that's very odd. You have to reply, you must consider making a report of suspicion to the FIS. So we'll come on now to the reporting obligations. Unless anyone's got any questions now about CDD, I've said the other obligations need to be aware of, which I said before, monitoring, record keeping, risk assessments, but CDD is normally the one you'll be examined on. That's why I'd really recommend you fully get to grips with. And if you can basically just remember the 4 situations where you apply it, the 3 kinds of CDD there are, and what's involved in enhanced CDD, that, certainly looking at previous bar exams, is kind of the information you need to know. That's more or less always what's covered in the exam. I say, make no promises going forward, but that in the past, historically, is what the ethics paper is covered on the AML side in terms of CDD. Any questions on CDD at this stage? No? Okay, let's talk about reporting in a bit more detail. We touched on that this morning, the fact that the reporting obligations apply to any information acquired in the course of business. So if you are doing your job and you become suspicious, even if you're not doing transactional work, you have an obligation to make a report. So the obligation applies when you have knowledge, suspicion, or reasonable grounds for suspicion. So it's objective mental element there, so be aware of that. That's not the same in all countries, that's the Guernsey regime. That you have reasonable grounds of suspicion that another person is engaged in money laundering or terrorist financing, or that property is or represents the proceeds of crime or terrorist property. So that second limb is intended to capture attempted transactions, basically. So if someone comes, I've got some money I want to put into your bank, and they don't do it, you have a suspicion that money is probably the proceeds of crime, you need to make a report, even if they haven't actually carried out any money laundering, you think that property is suspicious. And money laundering and terrorist financing is defined for these purposes as the money laundering offences in the proceeds of crime law and the drug trafficking law, and terrorist financing is the offences in the terrorism crime law. But not just those offences, it also applies to sanctions that relate to terrorism. We'll come on to those later on. So it's slightly wider. It's any kind of offence or activity to do with terrorism, whether it's someone on a sanctions list or the activity defined in the terrorism law I mentioned this morning, whether it's continental shelf or whatever else it might be. So anything like that you must report, but only if it comes through the course of business. If after work you're going home and you're having a drink with somebody and someone comes up a conversation and it's not a work thing, then someone you play cricket with mentions something, you think that sounds a bit dodgy to me. You're not obliged to make a report of suspicion. You may choose to do that, but you're not obliged to do that. It doesn't come with a reporting obligation. And as I said, it of course covers attempted transactions are covered. Now the significance of making a report in terms of criminality, so there are 2 things. One is it's a criminal offence not to make a report, so you are avoiding criminal liability. But also the effect is it gives you a defence to money laundering if you have made a report and then the FIS then consents to you doing whatever was the subject of the report. I won't go into that in detail here because the consent regime is not really relevant to the ethics paper. It's covered on the criminal paper. I'm going to speak on that next time for the criminal session. But just be aware that if you make a report and you say, is it okay for me to do this? And the FIS say yes, you then got a defence to money laundering or terrorist financing, as the case may be. So what does suspicion mean? Well, that's not defined in the legislation, in the disclosure law or in the terrorism law. I should say the reporting obligations under those 2 laws are identically worded. So if you look at one, that tells you all you need to know about the other. There's no difference. But what it means is awareness of a more than a fanciful possibility. And I say that because that was how it was interpreted in the context of UK legislation in the De Silva case, and that's now been applied in Guernsey in the case of Jacob International versus HSBC. So Guernsey courts applied that same test. That is the test. Is it more than a merely fanciful possibility? Now that to me still is quite open, because you've got to decide what fanciful is. That's a judgment call. But like many things in legal systems, it's a question of where you think it fits along the spectrum. You've got to make a judgment call whether you think it's more than merely fanciful. If you make a report, obviously that involves probably breaching your client's confidentiality, but you are protected against any civil liability for that by specific language in the legislation, but only if it's done in good faith. So if you make a report about somebody because he's having an affair with your wife and you want to get him in trouble, and you say, well, I think he's vicious, and that's not in good faith, then you're not protected by the confidentiality provisions. And this has arisen this is also looked at in the case of K Limited against NatWest in the UK, and Shah and HSBC. Not to have a look at those cases, because Shah also applied in Jacob. That talks more generally about what good faith means and the company you can expect to see if someone's acting in good faith. But by and large, if you are doing your job to the best of your ability, it's hard to see how you not be acting in good faith, how you fall foul of that, and not come across a case where someone's fallen foul of that. It's very egregious, like I say, someone just trying to make trouble because they've got a personal action going against somebody. I've never come across that in practice, but that's the only situation I can readily think of where you've been not acting in good faith and therefore not protected by the confidentiality provisions. So that's the legal structure of the reporting framework. The process itself, if you're not the MLRO, then you have to make an internal report to your MLRO or the nominated officer, and the nominated officer will then or the MLRO or nominated officer will then make a report to the FIS. And there's a procedure for doing that, which is set out in regulations made under the disclosure law and the terrorism crime law. And that procedure basically is making an online report through the Themis system, which is the FIS's online reporting product. You go into that and you just tick in various boxes, whatever, and give information. There is also a form, a standard form attached to the regulations, which you can use with their consent. That's only really there if there's some computer glitch or something, but if it's not there, if there's no problem with the system, you should be using Themis. So you go on that online and do it that way. It's a confidential, secure reporting line. It's called Themis. It's just the name of their. It's just the name of their particular product. Themis system, THEMIS. It is in the slides. I haven't mentioned it. You can get hold of the slides. But if you can't use Themis for whatever reason, or there's some other reason why you can't, then you have to go and use the hard form, which is appended to the regulations, but only if FIS consent. So what happens if you don't make a report? And you should do. Well, it's a criminal offence, as I said, but there are some statutory defences. So the first is if you have reasonable excuse. Now, again, that's not defined in the legislation. This is something where, when we were evaluated last time, our evaluator had real trouble with this. He was from a civil law jurisdiction. He kept saying, well, why don't you just set out the circumstances? Well, because that's not how our legal system works. Common law jurisdictions are much more flexible. If you set out every situation, you're going to miss one, and then might be doing hardship to somebody because they had a good excuse, but it wasn't one you'd laid out. So we prefer to leave it flexible. That was an uphill, down day. I lost several years of my life over that argument, but when we got there in the end. But basically, as in many areas, I mean, that's a common defence. We've all seen that in many criminal offences, reasonable excuse. So what would it mean? Well, we can all think of examples, but let's say you thought you'd made a report through Themis. It turned out there was some computer glitch you didn't know it hadn't gone through. That would be an obvious one. Or you were going to make a report, but then you got a phone call saying that your father had a heart attack and you're on the plane to the UK. Whatever, I'm thinking fantasy situations here, but it would have to be something pretty severe, I would say, to have a reasonable excuse. Because if you've got a suspicion, there's no reason not to disclose it, unless you can show there's something exceptional like that. But that's the kind of situation, really. But as I said, if we try to legislate for all of those, we'd miss some. So that's the reason. Then obviously the other one you'd expect to see there is if it's privileged, the information's come to you in privileged circumstances. If your client asks you for advice and says, I'm a bit concerned about this, you don't have to go and make a report of that suspicion if that's come to you in privileged circumstances. But that privilege will not apply if it's being given to you to further a criminal purpose. So again, to take an extreme example, if your client says, I want to launch some money and I want you to help me, and I'm telling you this so I want you to go and do something or other, put something in place for me, you have got to go and report that. You can't say, well, it's privileged, so I can't share it. Again, I can't readily think of an example. I've never come across one, certainly this jurisdiction when that's happened. But just be aware that is.
But if somebody came to you and said, I think someone's about to make suspicious activity or done some suspicious stuff, that'd be privileged.
Yeah, but if they're not telling you, it's hard. If that's what they said, there wouldn't necessarily be any criminal purpose in them telling you that. You acquiring that knowledge, not being given to further criminal purpose. If it then said, so because of that, I want you please to go and tell my mum to move some money quickly or whatever, then it would be, and therefore it's not covered. So it depends. Like I say, I've never come across it, but that's just there to prevent people usually exploiting that and treating it as a loophole, basically. I say it's hard to think of how that would actually happen.
Yeah, but I suppose I'm just thinking. I suppose clearly somebody could come and ask you for legal advice in the Jacob case, or when their assets are tied up, they want a legal representation.
Yeah, they've got to ask. You've got to have a system that enables that.
So
that's why the privilege is there. But if they ask you to do something to help them out, then it'd be different. And then the other, this is an interesting one for anyone working in a regulated business like you guys, is if you have not had training, that's when that your employer should have given you. So if you have not been trained to look for recognised money laundering terrorist financing, even if I'm looked at objectively and say, well, hang on, that's obvious that it should be. You didn't spot that because you haven't been trained, then you're not penalised for not making a report. But be aware that defence will not apply, again, for obvious reasons, if in fact you had knowledge or suspicion, then the training's irrelevant, you saw it anyway. Only applies for the reasonable grounds element. There was reasonable grounds to spot it, you didn't spot it because you hadn't been trained. But obviously, if you know or suspect, you've got to make a report. And the other one is if you are a lonely cog in the machine and you made your report to MRO and the MRO did nothing with it, you're not liable for that. That's down to the MRO. So if you made a report to suspicion and then it all goes wrong somehow, that is not your problem.
And so if I'm not was then the obligation or the fault for with those who should train properly?
If you're not trained, no, the fault will lie with them, but it won't be failure to report. They'll be penalised for their failure under the ML or the ML regime for not giving you training, because they themselves won't have the knowledge. They won't be tainted with your knowledge because they haven't been told anything, so they can't prosecute for that. But they will be liable under the regime, and the court will take a pretty dim view of that, and so will the GFSC. And the court will take into account, as I said before, any guidance issued by the GFSC. So if you have acted, if they've said to you, if the handbook, that basically means the handbook. When there are references in this context to guidance by the GFSC, that basically means the handbook. That is their guidance, essentially, unless there's a special additional document. By and large, it's a handbook. So if you followed all the things the handbook tell you to do, there's quite a lot of detailed information on reported suspicion in there. If you followed that and done your best to follow that, and you've got it wrong, the court will take that into account to see whether or not you're guilty. Or mitigation at the very least if you're convicted, but they'll may give you a discharge or whatever. Now it's 12:05. What do you want to do? Do you want to? I was thinking we could either carry on with this and then have a break and deal with the sanctions half after lunch, or we could stop now. What would you prefer to do? In total, I would say an hour, maybe an hour and a half. There's not much till sanctions. No, why don't we press on and then have a break, have lunch, and then sanctions after lunch? Does that work for you? Because what I would also want to do, which isn't on the slides, but I'm going to hand out at the end some examples of factual situations. I want to have a discussion of what you think you would do in that situation. So that'll take a bit longer. So it'll be longer than the slides will show, and that covers both the AML and the sanction side. So we need to finish that first. So I would suggest we carry on now and then have a lunch break and then do sanctions and then do those exercises. But I should have a 5-minute loo break if that's all right. So.
Information last night.
The original,
Yeah, the original.
oh,
So that's, so it's watching it right now.
Let's see.
Evenings, the Grinch. But he gets something from the original. So that was last night. That's like watching it. The lady in the
why are you torturing me?
That's just
release it. That was our first Christmas movie. Yeah. You were missing all the weekends.
Yeah.
Let's start getting them all in.
You wouldn't watch it.
yeah, I think
Oh. I was like, wait, what's right?
Sportsman of the year, right?
Like broken, crumbling, slippery.
Yeah. I might get a chocolate.
yeah. Nice and salty, actually. Yeah,
I understand that. Obviously, no problem. Yeah. Oh, I forgot to stop. God, I wasn't home. Oh, my loo break over there for the world to see. I'm going to forget this afternoon. I'll forget to do this. Okay, so we mentioned the consequence of failure to report as criminal offence unless you can show one of the defences applies, or that or there's nothing in the GFC guide to use that will help you. I just want to touch on the Jardine case in Jersey. I think you've heard about this case. It's the only case I'm aware of that's been prosecuted for failure to report in either Guernsey or Jersey. And Michelle Jardine was an MLRO who was acquitted of failure to report in Jersey, and it's quite an interesting case because it has some unusual features to it. Basically, what happened was she was approached by a Ukrainian PEP, or her business was approached, and she was informed about this by a Ukrainian PEP, and she began to go, or the firm began to go through the CDD process, and the Ukrainian PEP then withdrew. So, on the face of it, a classic attempted transaction, failure to report. So I think she declined the business, and maybe I'm not quite sure that they withdrew or she declined. But either way, the business did not proceed. But she did not make a report. Some time passed, and she then left Jersey, left working in the industry altogether. And then Jersey were coming up to their Moneyval evaluation. This is in 2016. And she was suddenly served with a notice that she was going to be prosecuted, which she was. And she was acquitted. And one of the arguments that was run was it was an abusive process because the Jersey authorities were only doing this to get their Moneyval stats up. Now, I have no idea if that's true or not. But when I heard the facts of the case, I thought that was a pretty odd case to acquit somebody on, because frankly, if ever there was a clear-cut case where you should make a report, that must have been it. So I wonder whether, I mean, obviously it's not binding on us in any way, and it's not, there's no sort of reasoned judgment because it's a criminal case. We didn't go to appeals, so there's no reasoning that we can look to. But I think when the case came out, the lawyer on the Jersey firm came to give presentations on it. He was saying, this is a good example of the kind of thing the court will look at. And whatever. But on my view, that would be a mistake. I think that that case had two features which made it unusual. One is she was no longer working there. she'd left the jurisdiction, no longer working in the financial services sector at all. I think if she had still been working in Jersey, the court would have taken a different view. I also think the passage of time, whether or not, I've no idea whether or not Jersey were trying to get their stats up or whether they're just inefficient delay, but the passage of time is not a factor. My suspicion is if she had been prosecuted straight away and there was no issue of money valve, clouding the issue, whatever, she would have been convicted, because I can't really see how you would not report in that situation. A Ukrainian PEP, then you've got concerns about, you then withdraw it, don't take the business. So what I'm saying is I think it'd be a mistake if any of you went to presentations that the lawyer gave at the time or heard about this and there's stuff on their website about it. Yeah. I think if you were to listen to that and say, well, that's actually an example of where you don't need to report, I'd be very, very wary of that, because that case had unique features, and I think in a different situation, I think she would not have been acquitted. That's my sense.
How's that relevant? That money that was coming in.
Yeah, well, just muddy the water. I don't know. I mean, he just addressed the court and muddied the water sufficiently. So there's, well, I guess if you run an abusive process on you try to get the prosecution shut up on the ground it's an abusive process, then you're entitled to raise anything, I guess. I don't know the ins and outs of the case. But either way, all I would say is I'd be very, very wary of taking to heart what that lawyer was saying at the time over here at presentations and in Jersey about this showing you the kind of thing the court would look at, because I don't believe in a different universe that would have happened.
Why not she got explanation at that time?
I can't remember. I think she said she wasn't suspicious or something. I can't. Yeah, although it wasn't really had to be reasonable. Really. Yeah.
Well,
So
just to kind of test that a little bit, just because a PEP approaches you and doesn't take it forward, I mean, is there a presumption of suspicion?
There's a higher risk in it. You could have
There's a
been
higher risk,
more.
Yeah, so like now we're in class and we're talking, so yeah, that definitely makes sense. It's, a time when you would make a suspicious activity report, but he's just a pet.
oh, indeed, it doesn't automatically mean that.
So
No,
I suppose that's what I'm asking. Like,
but it's the fact that he then, when she started asking questions, he then withdrew.
okay, so it was kind of
Or she declined. I forget the circumstance exactly, but she began to ask him questions and was clearly concerned. Either she was sufficiently concerned about the responses to withdraw, decline the business, or he withdrew. I forget now which way it was. But either way, there was something around it.
There was more.
Yeah. Oh, yeah. I'm not saying otherwise we'd have a law saying anyone who approaches you make a report. We're not doing that.
Yeah,
That's
yeah,
not that. I take your point. That isn't the situation. But the fact was, for whatever reason, it didn't go ahead.
She tested it.
Yeah.
But she already had it.
Yeah. Indeed. Yeah. So so that's an interesting case. But I just mentioned it because I was concerned at the time when I heard this guy saying all this stuff, thinking, well, actually, that could mislead people, because the reason she was acquitted, I'm sure, I say, is the lapse of time and the fact she was no longer working in the island.
And is that something that we would be expected to remove? I'm sure we'll all read that as part of our preparation, but is that something we might be expected to
I'm not the examiner, so
but I mean, the fact that it's a Jersey case.
I'll put it this way, I don't think it would harm you
Yeah.
to refer to it. If you ask a question about reporting suspicion, the fact you're aware of it won't do you any harm. But I don't think it will fail you if you don't mention it. If there's a question, what is the name of the one case in Jersey? There won't be. So. Okay, tipping off. Let's just get through this one.
You said there isn't a failure to report where anybody was either convicted or acquitted.
No, there's an ongoing case at the moment you may have heard about an MLRO who's currently facing, currently facing prosecution. So that's one to watch. But I think to date, I've only ever heard of one case where someone should have made a report and didn't, and I think in that situation, criminally didn't. And I think in that situation it was decided that it would be dealt with by a penalty, by given a civil penalty given by the GFSC. I forget the reason, but there's not been a criminal case like that. I forget the circumstances, but I've only been aware of one that's been brought to my attention. Okay, then tipping off. This is a very difficult issue for people, really, because here you really are walking a tightrope with your client. Tipping off, basically, as you would understand, if you have a reporting regime which involves telling law enforcement or the FIS who may pass on to law enforcement the fact there's a suspicion. If you tell your client that, that may then, and then give rise to investigation. If you've notified your client you've done that, that could obviously genuinely impede the investigation. So there has to be some prohibition on that happening, and anti-tipping off measures are required under FATF standards. So under the disclosure law and the terrorism crime law, it is an offence if you disclose to any person your knowledge or suspicion that a report has been made or will be made, or information relating to that will be communicated to the FIS or to your MLRO. So if you basically alert anybody to the fact that the report has happened or is pending, you are committing a criminal offence. That is wider than the equivalent offence under the Process of Crime Act in the UK, just so you're aware, because I think that language is it's only an offence if there are reasonable grounds to believe that no prejudice in investigation. And the reason we have a more draconian offence is twofold. One, because a subjective belief about prejudice in investigation is quite a hard thing to evidence. But also, at the time we were being evaluated by the IMF in 2010, and they had real problems with that wording in our legislation, and we decided to tighten it up in order to make sure we saw off a negative finding from the evaluation process. You have basically three, under the old process, it's not the case now, but you used to have a 3-month window. Anything you did in that 3 months after they left the on-site visit will be taken into account. So we just legislated after they got to tighten that up a bit. However, that then meant that people were struggling because under the regulatory regime, you need to inform your MLRO and the board about risks of the business. If you have to make various reports, you can't tell your board about that. That makes it harder for them to assess whether the risk in the business lies. If you're saying, for example, we made 20 reports last year about a particular kind of business, your board does need to know that to make a valid risk assessment. And we recognise that fact, that the language of the typical offence on one level could be taken as prohibiting that. And so in 2011, the procurator, who was the prosecuting authority in Guernsey, as you know, issued guidance making it clear that you would not be prosecuted if you notified somebody for discharging your internal AML CFT functions and responsibilities. So you protection prosecution for that, but not if you actually believe the disclosure of prejudice investigation. So if, for example, you think someone on your board is hand in glove with a criminal and you've made an STR, if you go and tell that person on the board about that, you've got a good chance of thinking, again, it's an extreme case, I can't really see how that would happen, but that could prejudice an investigation. So that's the situation there. So the procurator's guidance, if you want to find it, it's on the internet. I have put a reference to it in the study guides, but it's on the law officer's website. But that basically protects you if you need to make a disclosure to your board or anybody else for AML CFT purposes. Okay, so anyone got any questions about that so far? About the reporting regime kicking off? No? Okay, and the final bit on the slides, this is my favourite bit, these are some examples of the kind of things that people have said that have led to real STRs. If you haven't got slides, I'll read them actually, because some of them make me laugh. I mean, the fact someone say this, I find bizarre. I haven't declared this to the tax man. Another example was, that's one someone actually said, another one was a bank account was expected to receive around 100,000 a year, but payments, that's what the client was told the bank, but in fact they then received payments of over 3 million and no explanation was given. That was disclosed, and then the connections was made to a very serious UK investigation. Sorry, I didn't catch that. Say again.
There was a case where somebody was
All right. Okay.
and we questioned her about fines, and he said on several occasions that she had not declared some French taxman, the Frenchman gave her the warning that she needed for an herself, and she said, "Oh, it doesn't matter, because the law prescribed anyway," and repeated those statements. That was in the court. So we were in the courtroom. In the course of the business, somebody said exactly what you said. Say, here, is there an obligation for us to report it?
Was she just in? She was in France.
Yeah.
And had the monies come into Guernsey?
Well, no, there was no evidence.
No, because there has to be a Guernsey nexus, because your obligation is to report suspicion of money laundering, which is defined by reference offences in the Process of Crime law. So if there's no Guernsey nexus, there's no jurisdiction for those offences, and therefore they wouldn't come within the reporting regime. Not necessarily, no. Yeah, but if the activity, if the so-called money laundering activity, that has to have a Guernsey nexus, whatever that is. Otherwise, it won't come within the definition of money laundering, which is tied to the, if you think somebody in another jurisdiction is money laundering, because something you've heard, sitting in your office one day, you do some Googling, you see that, okay, you might be Googling for your business purposes, but it's got no nexus to Guernsey. You're not obliged to make a report to FIS. But there could be a Guernsey nexus, not just because the funds are going here, it could be because the company is being administered from here and the funds are elsewhere. So if there's a Guernsey nexus, that could bring within the scope the jurisdiction of money laundering offences under Guernsey law, and then you have to make a report situation. Also, I think that would probably count as reasonable excuse, but it's on the official court record. I think that'll be an interesting one to run actually. Perhaps I'll mention it to the police. We get some case law here, some jurisprudence. Yeah. Well, it gets written in the public gallery. If you just say as a spectator, it's fine. If they're to report, then yes, yeah, that's right. Well, I thought we had reports made by Milkman in the past, so you know. Another example was a client closed an account and wanted cash, saying he had a problem banking a cheque. Again, why would that be? The odd one. Someone wants to pay for legal advice in cash. Business loans repaid early with cash. A trust owns a company which declares a dividend of 100,000. The dividend turns out to be 200,000. It's not reflected in the company accounts, and no straight answers given as to that. An insurance premium is paid or a surrender requested by way of multiple checks from different sources or different payees. And these are all things that have happened in Guernsey cases. False invoices identified which support incoming funds from dubious sources, or overpayment of fees, and then a request after a check to refund. That's another classic money laundering one. So you ask for a request to come back by a check, and then that looks like the money's clean. This is my personal favourite, I think. My funds are frozen at the moment, so my friend in Spain will transfer you the deposit. Or exchanging large amounts of currency the post office to send abroad. Large and frequent currency exchanges. This is another one again, which I think is revealing, could apply to lawyers as well. Substantial funds placed into a gambling account, minimal gambling activity, then the funds are withdrawn. And then high value items such as antiques purchased solely with cash. That's illegal in law regime now, but all those things, they should be sending alarm bells through your mind. So those are some examples. They're all in the slides, just to give you a flavour for the kind of things that we've experienced in past reports we've made on. But that's obviously not an exhaustive list.
I was thinking the other day, what about, you mentioned antiques, what about watches? I've got some watches now that are selling.
Absolutely, yeah.
But our watchmakers, the retail.
Well, they can't. No, but they can't accept cash for that. Over £10,000. That then takes them outside the FATF definition, and that's why I've done it that way. So you've got an audit trail. Then, if you pay by cheque or card, you've got some record. Because obviously, as you point out, with watches, very valuable and a very portable item. If you trade in portable items in cash, there's no record of that at all. So you take it in and out anywhere you like, and no one would know what's going on. So the other thing I should have mentioned, actually, it's on the criminal paper, but it's interesting as well, is that's why we have a restriction on cash coming into the jurisdiction. To declare cash over a certain amount coming in or out of the country. And also, it's not just cash in the sense you might understand typically. It includes other things like bullion, postage stamps. That's an interesting one. We amended the legislation some years ago to add postage stamps. We had some intelligence saying that people were trading in very, very high value stamps. You can stick that in your wallet and go through customs, and go through this, and no one would know it was there. So you have to declare that as well. So that's why the declaration regime is as it is. To try to.
What's peanut butter, isn't it?
Yeah. Yeah. Well, you get some very inventive criminals, but yes. Okay, that's covered the AML side. Has anyone got any questions? We'll do sanctions after lunch, but has anyone got any questions at this stage about anything we've covered this morning? If it doesn't make sense or anything's confusing, please ask me, because I'm happy to take any questions. you may think it sounds stupid, but it's a complex area, so I'm happy to talk about it.
On tipping off, I mean, will we go into that kind of gap that exists between when you have reported a suspicious transaction, so you're waiting for the FIU? I think Julia touched on it before, the FIS to come back to you and tell you what to do, and that can be many months, I think, and that's what I think that the Sean, no, not the Sean case, the
Jacob case,
Jacob case goes to. I mean, is there any resolution there as to what you can do or what you can say? Or, you know, I think
trustee was asked for net distribution that was subject to their consent.
that's right.
Yes, I mean, it is a difficult area. It's a difficult
You haven't
judgment
really
call.
gone into it. I'm wondering how much because it is quite a rich area of case law.
Well, it's more relevant to the criminal paper. I'm going to go into more detail on the criminal paper. It's not really coming up on the on this. You won't need to know that in this detail for the AML preventive framework. But I've got, when we did the criminal paper, for those who are doing it, we'll go into more detail.
Okay, so for the, I'm not doing I already blew my budget on the business.
But basically, I mean, it is a bit, obviously it's a tightrope for business. We do recognise that fact, but equally, it's a tightrope for us in a regime that meets international standards. We don't have that there. We're not going to comply. So it's always a balancing exercise. But I would say that by and large, if you, like in anything really, if you can show you've done your best and you've got reason why you've done what you've done, then you're unlikely, even if you get it wrong, you're unlikely to feel the full weight of the authorities against you. That's why we've got no real history of people being prosecuted for this stuff, because by and large, Guernsey is a compliant jurisdiction. Businesses are very well versed in their obligations. They're doing their best. And it's only when you get someone that there's an egregious breach or whatever, or there's no obvious reason why someone's done something, that you come on the wrong side of the law. So that's what I would say. I would say that because I work for the authorities, but but I genuinely do believe that it's true. I think that by and large, there's a very high level of willingness on the part of business to comply. We're lucky in this jurisdiction, and compared to some that you see, like in Monavale meetings and what I saw, we're very lucky here that we've got a well-educated and a well-versed business sector who basically want to comply and want to do their best. So, and that is acknowledged. So it's only when it's an egregious breach that we go after you. Okay, so shall we reconvene at in an hour's time and go on to sanctions and then the examples?
How long might take that?
I don't know.
It's probably going to be an hour to do that.
Okay, I think that's working. Or was it paused? Okay. Yeah, so sanctions. We finished the AML this morning. Anyone have any thoughts over lunch and they want to raise that weren't sure about, that's wandering through? No. One thing I perhaps should have mentioned and didn't is what's meant by process of crime. You'll need to know this in detail for the criminal paper, but it's worth bearing in mind as well. What a crime for these purposes is based on underlying conduct. So we haven't got a list of crimes that come in the frame. What we have instead is language which says process of criminal conduct. And criminal conduct is defined as anything other than drug trafficking, which is the same regime, which constitutes an indictable offence if committed in the bailiwick, or which would constitute an indictable offence if committed here. So, in other words, if it takes place overseas, it doesn't need to be criminal in the place where it occurs, but it does need to be criminal here. And it's the conduct that matters, not the classification. So this often comes up, for example, in the context of tax fraud, because we don't have a dedicated offence of tax evasion. We have various offences under the tax law about not paying certain tax, whatever, but there's no standalone tax evasion offence. The way we deal with that, we've been giving, we've prosecuted money laundering for tax evasion, we've given assistance on that basis for many years. The way we deal with that is because we have very widely phrased fraud offences. And anything you can think of that might constitute tax evasion, like making a false statement, not making a statement, concealing information, comes within one or other of our fraud offences. So we are confident we've for many years given assistance and prosecuted on the basis that the conduct involved in tax evasion is conduct that is contrary to the laws generally and is entitled to tribunal indictment. So that's how we deal with that. So that's just a point to be aware of, because some jurisdictions have a list-based approach and others will only consider it a predicate crime, it's a language predicate offence, underlying offence. Then they consider it as that if it occurs overseas, as long as it's criminal where it happens. But we don't have that. So we have what's called single criminality as opposed to dual criminality that has been on both countries. That's just something to bear in mind.
So that makes
It does indeed, yeah. And we take a pragmatic approach to that as a prosecuting authority, and we would not. And the procurator has recently. This is not for publication, but the procurator has recently. I don't know if it's in the public domain yet, but the law officers have indicated to the GFSC, who made a query about an investment in a fund to do with cannabis, whether or not they would regard that as money laundering. And the advice from the law officers was they would not regard it as money laundering. So, but the reason for that, of course, is because that comes in the drug trafficking regime, and that is dual criminality based. The drug trafficking regime applies to drug trafficking is defined as offences under the Vienna Convention. We're getting into detail, really, it's a bit complicated, but basically for drug trafficking, there's a dual criminality requirement because it's based on the Vienna Convention. So it applies to countries that have a corresponding regime under the Vienna Convention. So you've got to show that the drug trafficking active in your country is also criminal in the Vienna Convention country where it occurred. And so, for example, in the case of Canada, which has now legalised recreational production of medicinal and I think even recreational, certainly cannabis, that would not meet the test in the drug trafficking law because Canada's a Vienna Convention country, and so the two laws are not parallel. So we have to give, under the comity principle, we've got to respect their law under the Vienna Convention. So the drug case is in fact dealt with under the drug trafficking law. The more difficult one was something like, let's say, proceeds of bullfighting or sex working in Holland or something, where there isn't that will come with the proceeds of the crime law, and the test there is single criminality. We haven't had to confront that one yet, so we'll see how that goes. But again, ultimately, prosecution's only ever brought in Guernsey if it's in the public interest. The prosecuting have got a binding but it's true. They've got a binding code of conduct they have to comply with, and they've got to be satisfied that there is sufficient evidence to justify bringing it to trial, and that it's in the public interest to prosecute. So if you had something where that gives us leeway to take a decision if we had to, in a case with actually, is it in the public interest? Does somebody legitimately raise money for bullfighting in Spain and then inadvertently invested it or whatever? Their view would be taken on that, whether or not it was in the public interest. We apply the Crown Prosecutor's Guidelines in the UK, which say that. Never mind that. Anyway, I just wanted to cap off the story. So I was conscious I hadn't cut them off this morning, just so you know, that's the base of it. So if it's drug trafficking, it's dual, but if it's anything else, it's single criminality. Okay, so sanctions, international sanctions. This is something which is quite a hot topic because whenever you get any sort of hotspots in the world internationally, you will get a cry for sanctions regimes. You've seen in recent times sanctions being put in place against Russia on the back of the triple poisonings. We had a lot of sanctions issued at the time of the so-called Arab Spring. We had sanctions against North Korea and Iran for proliferation financing. Also, as you'll be aware, Trump has recently reinstigated sanctions that have been dropped against Iran and brought them back. So it's an issue that's in the news a lot. And it comes up on the ethics paper because sanctions, the international sanctions regime is something we sign up to, and it could be something that could arise in your work as lawyers, and you need to be aware of what to look out for and what possible consequences could follow if you did not be mindful of the sanctions regime that applies here. So just to give you some background, sanctions initially were initiated by the UN in their modern form. They date from the Second World War, and there are arguments that can go back to the classical period of sanctions, but we're not going to go about that one. The Second World War was when it really kicked off, and the United Nations Charter, which enables the United Nations Security Council to issue resolutions which impose non-violent solutions to foreign policy problems, essentially. And as a result of that, in 1946, the United Nations Act was enacted by the UK, and under that act, the UK could issue measures, orders in council to give effect to UN Security Council resolutions imposing sanctions, and they had the power to issue orders in council for the Crown dependencies as well at the same time. So in 1946, when Guernsey had very little in the way of any kind of independent foreign policy or any leanings in that direction at all of our sanctions measures basically were imposed directly from London by order in council under the United Nations Security Act. And that was the position for really quite a long time. But again, this is another example where if you have a question in the Baylis paper about Guernsey's developing international personality, you can throw this one in, because what happened over time was that the EU, really in the 90s, the EU began to emerge as a significant sanctions-making body in its own right. And what it would do, it would enact regulations that gave effect to anything the UN had imposed, but in a way that made them automatically legally binding on member states. So it'd be a regulation that you had to comply, you were automatically bound to comply with. And also sometimes add their own sanctions in for good measure. But basically, all the UN measures that the UN have promulgated have been enacted by the EU. And what Guernsey and Jersey and the Isle of Man started doing in the 90s was giving effect to those EU regulations ourselves under the EU implementation law, which you should have come across in your work on the Baylis paper. But that is basically a bit of primary legislation that enables Guernsey, Alderney and Sark by ordinance give effect to any EU measure which they consider to be necessary or expedient to be effective. And so that became a useful mechanism to give effect to EU regulations dealing with sanctions. And that's what we started doing. It was a lot quicker because basically we are obliged to comply certainly with the UN, although we're not EU member states, we're not obliged to comply with anything the EU does outside Protocol 3. We are obliged to comply with UN sanctions because the UN Charter extends to Guernsey. So we have a legal obligation, international law, to give effect to UN sanctions. And it was much more convenient to do that by giving effect to EU regulations that implement them than going to London. The process was very time consuming and often they forget, well, obviously you can imagine, we're not high up on their radar, so they'd be issued an order in council, often forget about us, and they say, well, hang on, what about more for us? Oh yeah, okay, and that's where you look back at the history. You'll see that often months, sometimes years of delay between an order in council for the UK and one for the Crown dependencies or the overseas territory. And that wasn't satisfactory. It also meant that if there were amendments to the UN regime, we had to go back via London and get that done. We had no real control over it and it was very time consuming. Doing it under the EU route by ordinance, we can act very, very quickly. And we have an emergency ordinance making power under the reformed Guernsey Law 1948, whichever one it is, which says that the legislative committee can make emergency ordinances. So that meant we could act very, very quickly. The EU could issue a regulation, we could do an emergency ordinance and have that enacted straight away, which obviously, if it's to do with money, is very important in a finance centre because asset flight was very quick. We really couldn't wait 6 months for the UK to issue an order in council. By then, there was nothing left here. So that's what we did. That became the practice to give immediate effect to EU regulations that implement UN sanctions and more widely other EU measures, because even though we're not legally obliged to comply with autonomous EU measures, we're not part of the EU, there are various reasons why we do want to do that. One is constitutional, because obviously there's a long-standing convention, as you'll have come across in the Baylis paper, that we follow the UK's foreign policy. So for UK giving effect to EU regulations on sanctions, which until next February they have to, and we didn't do that, we'd have a different foreign policy in practice from the UK. So that was obviously never going to be viable. The UK would not have been happy about that. So we've always gone along in that way for that reason. But also there are some practical reasons as well. A lot of business here, as you'll be aware, is tied to London. If they're applying two different sanctions regimes, it makes life very difficult. It increases the frictional costs of doing business, and it could lead to breaches because people would not spot where the gaps were, and there could be real problems. And also, just reputationally, we do not want to be seen as being the weak link within the EU geographical network, not the legal network. Neighbours to the EU have a good neighbour policy. We do not want the headlines that would flow if monies are going through Guernsey to enable people to circumvent EU sanctions. The reputational consequence, that would be terrible. So for those reasons, we've always given effect to the full range of EU measures, even when they go beyond the UN. And the other thing to bear in mind is that EU measures dealing with, or sanctions generally dealing with terrorist financing and the financing of weapons proliferation are also required under the FATF recommendations. So if we didn't have an effective system for those, we'd be in breach of the FATF recommendations as well. So there's lots of reasons, it's also tied up together. There are lots of reasons why we've done what we've done. So that's our position, basically. We give full effect to all sanctions measures that are issued by the UN or the EU. And like I said, the legal mechanisms, it used to be an order in council under the United Nations. In fact, there are a few of those still in place, not very many. Iraq, so I can think of, there are only a handful now because, as I say, the process evolved over time, and that's nearly always done under the EU implementation law ordinances. So if you go on the States of Guernsey website, there's a very good page on sanctions there, and it'll list all the different regimes. And you can click onto that, and it'll tell you what the legal instrument is, whether it's Order in Council, if you're linked to that, whether it's an EU regulation. It's all set out there for you. That's a good question. What we've done, again, I'll come on to this at the end about looking ahead, but what we have done is implement, we've got approved last week, a new piece of primary legislation, sanctions law. That's an enabling law, and what that will do is enable the Policy and Resources Committee in Guernsey to give effect to UN sanctions, EU sanctions, or autonomous sanctions issued by the UK under their new sanctions legislation they've introduced into the back of Brexit when that starts taking effect. And then there'll be a political decision for PNR as to whether they go, which route they choose. They can do more than one, but we've made it very clear in the law, you can do it without prejudice. They could implement EU regulations and the UK if they wanted to. What they will do will be a political call when the position of the UK is clearer. At the moment, who knows what the future holds. But what we've done is put in place a legal framework so that we can act very quickly, depending on what the outcome is. If I were betting, I'd put money on us following the UK line for all the reasons I've outlined before about constitutional issues and convenience of business. But if, for example, we felt that the UK's regime was falling short of the EU and there were baddies on the EU list we wanted to sanction, we might implement that as well. I don't know. That would be my call. That's a political decision ultimately. But that's a way off yet. But the mechanism is now in place. So if whatever happens post-Brexit, we've got ability to do what we need to do. There's one other bit of legislation I want to mention to you, which doesn't come within the Order in Council or the ordinance. This is a standalone piece of primary legislation, which is the Terrorist Asset Freezing Law, 2011. And that makes us, that automatically imposes an asset freeze on anybody designated under a specific EU terrorism regime or by the Treasury in the UK under the Terrorist Asset Freezing Act in England. And there's also a power for PNR to make their own designations, but they've never done that yet. So that's a standalone piece of separate law. The reason for that is, I mean, again, I don't want to get too technical, but we had to have that to comply with the FATF standards, because one of the FATF recommendations is that you automatically freeze the assets of any person known to be involved in terrorism, including people in your own jurisdiction. And the EU's power to issue regulations is under a foreign policy competency, which meant they could not impose restrictions on EU internals, people within the EU. So if you just rely on that, there could be people there that you would not be capturing because they couldn't impose those measures on EU internals. And so what the UK has done is given itself a power for the Treasury to make additional listings, and we automatically implement those. So anyone who's in the EU who wants to put on the list, the UK just put on their list, and it's automatically effective here. So that's why it's done in that particular way. We've got standalone primary legislation. And the other area of sanctions, just to touch on, is export control legislation. And that is less of an issue for us than sanctions involving money, because obviously we don't have factories making loads of weapons parts and whatever else you might want to send away. But it isn't, you have to be aware of it because it could touch on some of what you do, and I'll come on to that in a moment. But I'll say less about that because it's a bit more in the background. We haven't got factories making widgets for North Korea or whatever, but it could touch us in some ways. So just be mindful of that as well. That's administered by the Guernsey Border Agency, and they've got stuff on their website about that as well. But I won't go into huge amount of detail on that. Okay, so I'll just go very quickly through what the restrictions are that you would find under sanctions. As I mentioned, there are import-export restrictions. Those are what they say on the tin. But some measures are applicable to particular countries. So you might have a regime that applies to Iran. The obvious ones, the ones you've most likely heard of: Iran, Russia, Syria, North Korea, but there are loads of others as well for all sorts of countries, lots of parts of Africa, for example. Democratic Republic of Congo, Belarus is one that's closer to Europe. There's a whole raft of them. So if you go on the States of Guernsey website on the sanctions page, I've put a link to in the study guide, you'll see that they're all listed there, so you can see for yourself. But the main ones that you'll have heard about, say, are Iran, Russia, and North Korea. They're probably the most high-profile ones. But also there are regimes that are applicable to organisations like Al Qaeda and ISIL as well. So, no. Well, I say that. Who knows? I'm not saying the paper, but historically, never would. No, it might come up in a very brief reference. It might say you're actually for a client who wants to send some money to North Korea. and you'd be expected to say, well, I would do a sanctions check because I know they've got a sanctions regime or whatever. And if it would come up, that's the level of it for the exam purposes. But for the purposes of being aware in practice, the rest of your working lives of what's going on, it's considered important that people are educated about what's out there and where to look. But obviously in the exam, you won't be expected to do a blow-by-blow account of every sanctions regime. I couldn't do it, so I wouldn't expect you guys to do it.
Have constant sanctions monitoring in place. There'll be lists that are constantly updated and monitoring. But I think your compliance teams or functions should be constantly monitoring that. And if you take on a client for a particular country that has sanctions, that should be flagged up.
Yeah, one would hope so. It doesn't always work.
Sure.
And the problem is you are responsible for that. You've got the fact you've outsourced it won't help you. It may be mitigation, but it won't be a defence. So. Oh no, indeed, no one possibly could. No, of course. And I work in this area, and I certainly claim to know that. So yes, you get some regimes that are targeted at particular countries or organisations. The others are, and these are the ones you most like to come across, targeted financial sanctions. So you get listed individuals, and that's where your compliance checks come in. They look at who's on the list and are they getting a match. One of the difficulties with that is fuzzy matching, because a lot of these names are from different kinds of alphabet or different kinds of or countries where the name can be spelled lots of different ways, and it's very common that it just doesn't come up. And then you say, hang on, why on earth are you making money available to Saddam Hussein or whatever, Osama bin Laden? So it didn't come up because they spelled it with a U rather than an O, and that's very common. It can split that other way. So and that's an extreme case. Most people know to do both, but there are lots of others where you wouldn't necessarily know that. Or if it's a Russian, it's a Cyrillic alphabet. That can throw people as well. Lots of search engines can't recognise terms in the Cyrillic alphabet. So there are lots of issues like that come up. So you need to be aware of that. But the targets are subject to asset freezes and also a prohibition on making funds or economic resources available to them. It's not just freezing their money. It also means you can't make financial products available to them either.
There was also, I forget which jurisdiction it is now because I want to, but there's a jurisdiction where the surname was actually the first name. So on the face of it, you have a list of potentially perhaps all the surnames or all the names are the same, then you have to.
That's right, yes, and suddenly realise it's not, yeah, absolutely, yes. And you've got to clean. And the other thing I'd say as well is that a lot of those international, private providers like WorldCheck or those sort of people, they don't always get it right. We had a case in Guernsey a few years ago where there was potential sanctions breach, and the person who put money in Guernsey had done a WorldCheck search and had that come up saying there were no sanctions in Guernsey for this particular regime. But that was just not true. So there's a big gap there. So you need to be quite wary that these are not foolproof.
Don't worry.
The data on the external provider that you don't want to have that down to them.
Yeah.
Oh, I see.
Yeah, and they were told someone not in the jurisdiction was looking at where to put their money, but who hasn't got sanctions in place against me? And they came up with, and it said Guernsey didn't have sanctions against this regime, which we did. And then of course the person tried to put money in Guernsey, and all kinds of alarm bells went off. And but that's just an example of how it wasn't complete. I don't know why they would have thought that, but they did. And it seems to me think, well, they go to every other regime bar that one. And they think, well, maybe they have. Yeah. I would have thought, but anyway. Yeah. So anyway, those are the regimes, the target asset freezes, and then also they used to. I put a framework in here about Iran. Just mention the Iran regime because that's been reinstigated by the United States. That was a much wider regime, which was not just about targeted individuals. That was any transfers to an Iranian person had to get prior approval or prior notification over certain thresholds. And that was really very time consuming. We got a lot of those coming through. People have no criminality attached to them at all, but because of the regime, the international community trying to bring Iran to its knees, basically, they required every transaction, every wire transfer of monies to be authorised or cleared in advance. That was then lifted by the Joint Comprehensive Plan of Action in 2016, but as you'll be aware if you follow the news, it's been reinstigated now by the United States. So again, be conscious of that fact, because you can be on the wrong side of that. And the United States are very, very hawkish in the way they go after people who they see as breaching their sanctions regimes. There was a case a few years ago of I think a Dutch national who had been sitting in Holland taking part in some sort of international transaction which involved sending money. I think it even sent an email. I had just been sent an email through America, but a very tangential link to America. Anyway, he was flying on holiday, flew through an American airport, dragged off the plane and prosecuted for sanctions breach because whatever he'd done was perfectly lawful in his own country, but there was enough of a nexus to the UK, to the US. They would argue he breached US sanctions. So it's not entirely fanciful that could happen. I don't want to scare anybody. And obviously, that was an unusual case. But all I'm saying is, I just mentioned the Iran restrictions because they have now been reinstigated by the Americans. So just let's say a bit more about targeted financial sanctions and how they work, because this is something that you're most likely to come across. And they apply to assets, and the language used certainly in the EU, the way they're phrased in the EU regulations, is very, very wide. So it's assets belonging to, owned, held or controlled by listed persons. Well, controlled can mean anything really. And how on earth do you define that? I don't know. That has caused problems over the years because people were very, very wary of doing anything. It was basically causing business to snarl up completely. The EU issued guidelines on this, which say that at the very least, it's more than a 50% holding of proprietary rights or majority interest. That's not definitive. You can still be controlling it in other ways, but if you've got that, you definitely are controlling it. And that's not binding on us, but the authorities here would always look for that sort of thing. If you had applied guidelines issued by, let's say, the EU or the UK, and you would turn out to be in breach, probably the authority will be fairly forgiving of that, because you tried your best to work out. And there's a lot of guidance as well, I should say, on the States of Guernsey website as well. There's a lot of guidance there about sanctions. So if you can show you've tapped into all that, and in any doubt, contact the Policy and Resources Committee and talk to them. Because if you show you've done all of that and you've tried your best to clarify what's okay and what isn't, you're much less likely to be on the wrong end of enforcement action. Another difficult concept is making assets available directly or indirectly for the benefit of a listed person. Again, there's a very, very wide concept. So if you were giving money to, or giving some financial benefit to somebody who was married to a sanctions target, is that making that money directly or indirectly available to that person? Who's to say? It depends on the circumstances. And there's a case which looks at that in the UK, we'll come on to in a moment. But they're very, very wide concepts. Of course, the reason for that is that if you try to narrow them down a bit more, if you draw a line around their scope, the bad guys immediately do whatever they need to do to put themselves on the far side of that line. Very easy to circumvent. So they try to keep it as open as possible, so that if you do get a case where you want to prosecute somebody, you can bring it within the scope of the restrictions. Okay, so licensing, this is another thing that we see a lot of, because obviously it's important that people have access to food and shelter and medical treatments and things like that, which they wouldn't have if you automatically froze all their funds. There are mechanisms under all licensing, under all sanctions regimes, to enable people to have access to frozen funds in certain circumstances. And although we give effect to international sanctions rather than having our own, the licensing authority is a domestic body. So in Guernsey, under all the ordinances made under the EU framework, the licensing authority is the States of Guernsey Policy and Resources Committee. Under the older UN Security Council resolutions going back to 1946 onwards, the authority there is the procurer. The reason for that really is historical. If you've done your history on the Baylis paper, you'll know that the years since we've seen a gradual shifting of power from the Royal Court to the States of Guernsey, is still part of that process. That government initially wasn't really geared up to this sort of thing, and so that power resided with the Royal Court, with the procurer. Over time, it's shifted across where it would now more appropriately sit to government, which is why under all recent regimes, it's a Guernsey committee. If it's for most regimes, it's like I say, it's PNR. For import-export licenses, that is the Home Department, because of the Commission for Home Affairs, because that is the committee that's responsible for the customs organisation. So that's why if you want a licence to export certain goods, you get that from the Commission for Home Affairs. Anything else you'd get from PNR, except for a few historical regimes. But all the recent ones, all the ones that you're likely to come across, that's all PNR. Okay, so we just touched on some liability issues. Breach of the criminal offence, like I said, and it's usually a strict liability offence. But there is a defence you can mount, that's obviously the burdens that are on you, if you can show you didn't know you were in breach of sanctions and it was reasonable for you not to know that. So essentially, although it's a strict liability offence, the prosecution has to prove any mental element, you can get out of it if you can show that it was reasonable for you not to do that. If you haven't done CDD, then you haven't got a cat and horse chance of making out that defence. obviously. But if you have done all the checks you could do and you've looked into this, done all the searches, it didn't come up, you may be able to demonstrate that that defence is made out. Especially if you've contacted the authorities as well and they've told you, yeah, that's fine or whatever. So, one thing to bear in mind, there's no tipping off involved in sanctions because sanctions lists are publicly known. So if you say to your client, sorry, but I can't make that money available to your sanctions list, you're not going to get a tipping off. He'd know that anyway, because his name's publicly listed, so he's not going to be surprised to hear that. But tipping off might arise, just be aware, if it's a sanctions regime which involves possible money laundering or terrorist financing. Not very many do, because most of them are foreign policy objectives, like to stop somebody committing human rights abuses. But there are 3 regimes that are to do with corruption. That's Ukraine, Tunisia and Egypt. And in those 3 regimes, people have been listed there because they are thought to have misappropriated assets from the state. So obviously, if those monies are being put through Guernsey, those are the proceeds of crime, and that could engage money laundering issues. So therefore, you could be in breach of tipping off if you say too much to that person about what you're doing with their assets. It was purely sanctions related, you'd be okay. But if you go beyond that, there could be an issue with money laundering. So just be aware of that. And also there, you have a dual reporting obligation because if I've got it, I'll do. There's a reporting obligation under the. Most sanctions measures have an obligation to report to the authorities any information that will facilitate compliance with the regime, and the authority for these purposes is the Policy and Resources Committee. But if it involves money laundering and terrorist financing, you might also engage the obligations we talked about this morning of the disclosure law and the terrorism crime law. So you might have to make a report as well to the FIS if it engages those. So not many regimes do. Obviously, the ones to do with terrorism do. So the terrorist asset freezing law would do, and also ones to do with Al Qaeda or ISIL would be terrorism as well. So you should make a dual report, and anything involving misappropriated assets would. But by and large, they don't. So Russia, that's not about anyone stealing assets. That's about invasion of Ukraine. So we're not talking about money laundering, terrorist financing there. Give another example. Or Iran or North Korea, the big ones, the ones to do with proliferation. Okay, so that's the criminal aspect. And then civil liability, there's usually, I say usually because the regimes are all different, but by and large, there is usually a provision in a sanction regime saying that there is no liability to a third party if you mistakenly withhold someone's assets and believe they're sanctioned, as long as it was not negligent and was in good faith. So again, you've got to show you did all your CDD and what you could do. But if you can show that you did as much as you could and you're acting in good faith, then no one can sue you if you mistakenly withhold their assets. Okay, so there's very little case law on any of this stuff. Sanctions is still really quite a developing area. In fact, I think it's probably sort of where money laundering was 10 years ago or so. The legislation's in place, but no one really understands how it works in very, very few cases. And the only cases I'm aware of in the UK are all civil cases where the sanctions regime has given rise to potential civil liability between parties. So there haven't been any cases of actual enforcement by the authorities of sanctions breaches that I know of, any criminal cases that I'm not aware of. And civil cases are reasonably instructive, but only to a limited extent. I mean, the one I mentioned a moment ago, the only case I know of where the concept of what's meant by owned or controlled or benefit of a third party, those issues in the EU law have been looked at. It's a case of Himicha and Barclays Bank. And that was a case about an injunction. So they were really looking at balance of convenience. It wasn't really deciding anything in a final way. But in that case, the plaintiff was, or claimant I should say, was, showing my age there, the claimant was the wife of a sanctioned person, and she wanted monies paid out to her by Barclays Bank, and the bank refused. They said, if we do that, we'll be making money indirectly available for the benefit of a listed person. And she sought an injunction to require them to, or written mandatory, to require them to make the payment. And that's what the court had to look at. So the court was really looking at all the things you look at in an injunction context, balance of convenience, all those sort of things. So it wasn't really deciding any guidelines for what would count as owner control, but it did look at this family setup, the way that the bank accounts worked, who did the shopping, all those sort of things. So have a look at that judgment to give you a bit of guidance on the sort of thing you'll be asked to look at. But it's also in the study guide as well. It doesn't. So it doesn't really tell you very much, but it's the best we've got at the moment. Like I said, because it was an injunction case, it didn't actually decide anything, and the case went away. So I assume she never then took it any further. It got. I don't know what happened to it, but there's no further ruling on it. And then there are two other cases, quite interesting. Sheer Shipping and Maud Limited Investment Authority. Those are two cases where parties tried to evade their civil obligations to one another because of a listing. And in DB Bank and Sheer Shipping was listed under the Iranian regime, and they owed money to DB Bank. And their argument was, we can't make that money available to you because we would be committing a breach of sanctions, because we would be making a payment from monies belonging to a listed entity, i.e. us. It's quite an inventive argument. Oddly enough, it failed. And the court said, well, there's a licensing regime which includes within it a license for making payments to discharge pre-existing contractual obligations. And we use that. I've actually advised quite a few cases myself on that in Guernsey, because we often get a situation where monies have been perfectly legitimately put into Guernsey or managed in Guernsey or whatever, and then the owner is subsequently sanctioned, and there are obligations attaching to that money, either to, let's say, to the trust and company service provider or whatever, to pay their fees, whatever, and so you need to get a license just to authorise that payment. That's quite a common situation. But the existence of the regime meant that Sheer Shipping could not just say, we can't do anything, sorry Gulf, we can't do anything with a sanctions breach. All you've got to do is apply for a license and you can make that payment, because the court would have authorised that. So they lost. And then in Maud against the Living Investment Authority, on that occasion, the payment was supposed to be made to a listed party. So the Living Investment Authority were owed money by Maud, some name of the company, I forgot what it was, but that was the short form of it. And Maud was saying, we don't need to make the payment to you, because if we do that, we're going to be in breach of sanctions, making economic resources available to a listed party. And again, the court said, nice try, but no. In fact, they won at first instance, actually, but they lost on appeal. Because again, the court said, well, you can just apply for a license. You've got a license to allow you to discharge contractual obligations, so you should go for that. So those are the only cases that I'm aware of where the sanctions regime has been looked at, which they don't show a huge amount of clarity on what's meant by owner controlled. But again, like I said, I keep coming up with the same message, but as long as you show you've tried, you've done your best, you've asked advice, that's the key message out of all this. It's a sort of evolving area, quite a few grey areas, but if you're looking to protect yourself, you just need to make sure that you've done all you can. I've put on the slide some good information sources. HMT Consolidated List. This is the list that you get on the Treasury website. I think it's that Office of Financial Sanctions Implementation website, which is part of the Treasury in the UK. They have a list of all sanctions targets under all regimes that apply to the UK, and because we follow the UK's the same measures, they're all ones that apply to us as well. So if you go on that list, that's a good place to start for looking for whether someone's a sanctioned entity. If you're looking for yourself, obviously there are commercial providers like WorldCheck. If you want to look for yourself, I always go there if I'm asked a query, because it's quicker than going to all different regimes. Just go straight into that list, they're all in there. Then there are sanctions notices on FEMAS. I don't know if you've been aware of any of these coming through, but the FIU issue these whenever there's an addition to a sanctions list. They send a notice saying, be aware that there's been an addition to the list, or name's been taken off the list, or the change, go and look at this, but be aware of that. So that's another good source of information. And those lists, they go out on FEMAS, which is, as I said before, is the FIS's computer system. And they go direct to every MLRO in Guernsey, every financial services business, every law firm, every estate agency, whatever. They've all got a link to it. So that's a good source of information as well. So that updates you whenever there are any changes. And then there are various websites. As I said before, the States of Guernsey is a very good one. We've got a very detailed page on sanctions. There's a bit of information on the GFSC website, the Treasury website, and if you go on the websites of the EU and the UN, they're also information. If you're really keen, there's information on there as well. There's lots of places to look. And then applying sanctions in practice. Well, in your working life, this is likely to arise in two ways. One is your own client base, your own exposure to sanctions breach. To take on clients or get involved in activity which is in breach of sanctions, but probably more likely is that you'll be asked to advise financial services businesses, especially if you're litigators. That's what they'll probably be asked to advise about that. I know that happens a lot on the scale of the scope of the sanctions regimes. That's why another reason why it's really important to be aware of it. I mean, at least to this level, because you're quite likely to be asked to say it's a growth area, more likely to be asked questions about it going forward. So those are the two areas. In terms of your own exposure, I would say that it could happen if you were asked to act for a listed person, but that's not really very likely for a law firm, probably. It's more likely to arise if you're inadvertently involved in sanctioned transactions. So, for example, if somebody wants to send a shipment of goods from the UK abroad somewhere, but the company doing it is administered in Guernsey, and they may say, well, we need some contractual documents drawn up to cover this. They might go to a local law firm and say, can you help us draft some documents to sort out this transaction with selling goods? And it might turn out that somewhere in that chain there's going to be a shipment going to Iran or North Korea or something like that. So that's in my judgment probably the most likely way that a law firm would be involved, except when they're advising clients. But for their own exposure, it's most likely to be that. So, and again, because we don't have factories making this stuff, it probably won't be anyone directly acting here. It'll be a company administered from here. That's probably the most likely way that you come across that, I would say. Or possibly, yeah, putting their payments through Guernsey, having it back or something like that. But it won't actually be the goods being produced here. I say that now, probably tomorrow in the Guernsey Press, it's a big article saying scandal. A factory in Torf has been found to be producing nuclear warheads. But yeah. Okay, so that's all I want to say about sanctions. Any questions? Then just looking ahead to changes to the legislation that will affect the ethics paper. As I mentioned, there's a new sanctions law. That's not in force yet. It was approved by the states last week, and it's got to be approved by the Privy Council. So for the time being, the sanctions regime will remain as it is, as I've described it. And that was the regime as of July last year, which is the cut-off point for exams. That's what you need to know. But obviously, it's worth knowing if you're looking for it, picking up extra marks, looking ahead, so you know there's a new enactment. The key difference about that I should have mentioned is that that is bailiwick-wide. The current regime for EU measures has to be separate for Jersey, Alderney and Sark because the vires under the implementation law is for each island to do its own measures to affect EU measures, which is a real pain in the neck because obviously we want to make it bailiwick-wide. We've got 3 separate ordinances, 3 different jurisdictions, 3 different legislators to approve it. It's a hassle. So the new law will be bailiwick-wide. So the PNR will make regulations that will apply across the whole of bailiwick. And that day cannot come soon enough as far as I'm concerned. We need to draft these things. But anyway, that's a way off yet. But just be aware that that's coming down the wire. And then process of the crime side of things, as somebody mentioned, there was an amendment to the process of the crime law approved last week. And what that has done is essentially taken the regulatory framework that currently exists in separate regulations and put it as a schedule, a new Schedule 3 to the process of the crime law. And also it's combined the regimes that all parties subject to AML obligations, so financial services businesses, lawyers, accountants, estate agents are all subject to one identical regime now rather than 2 separate ones. So it's all in one place. That won't come into force till the end of March. In terms of what's in those new requirements, they're broadly speaking the same, but there are a few changes that Asal mentioned this morning about domestic pets being caught, didn't used to be captured, pets just used to be foreign. There are a few changes like that, but broadly speaking, it is the same framework because it's still giving effect to the standards. Just a few changes, but the structure is different. It'll now be in the process of crime law itself rather than the regulations. And the handbook is also being revised as well. But the new handbook, again, won't be effective for a while. And you can see, I've been assured that you can access, for your revision purposes, you can continue to access the regulations and the handbook on the GOPC website. That's what you need to be familiar with for this exam. So I did get worried thinking what will happen if they bring a new handbook in for the exams. It'll be taken away, you won't find it, but I'm told it will still be there. So those are the only changes coming forward in this area. So just be aware those are happening. Like I say, I have been assured that they won't affect you in the exam questions. And if I get any say on the AML sanction side of things, obviously I'll make sure that nothing is inconsistent. I'll try to make sure nothing is inconsistent with what I've said today. Okay, any questions on any of those topics? No? Okay, I'm going to hand out now something I prepared earlier. Just a few examples of some situations. I thought we'd just talk through what you think. I think that's enough. What you would do, and what you think you would do in this situation. Oh, I should also say, by the way, sorry, at the end of the ethics study guide, I've put in there a checklist, a take-on checklist, and it's purely for illustration. Do not use that if you've got your own ones on your phone. Please don't use mine. So I was told to do that, just to illustrate the kinds of steps you want to think about going through. That was really to the point of view answering the exam question. You just go through and look through that and just say that makes it. I thought that made it easier for people to see, but that's not. Yeah, like I say, if you've got your own ones, you'll have your own businesses. Go for those and use that instead. But
Anyway, they did that, make clear in the exam that one might be able to rather than say we should do. But for the exam purposes, we treat this as the.
well, these to set out the kind of things you should be looking at. So if you in the exam went through all these stages,
And added things that
yeah, that would be really good. Yeah. Okay, so let's look at the first one on the list. Oh, I'll just wait for them to come back actually.